Hi everyone, welcome to Mr. Evan Crime Stories. I know you can't sleep, so I'll accompany you with true crime stories from around the world. Before we get into tonight's story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now turn the lights down, get comfortable, let the rain play softly in the background, and let's begin. Story 1. It was Christmas Eve in 1945. Across the United States, families were preparing for Christmas morning. The Second World War had only recently ended, and for many families, the holiday carried a special meaning. People were finally beginning to experience something that had been missing for years: peace. At a quiet home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family was preparing to spend Christmas together. George and Jenny Sodder lived there with their children. They were a large family, with 10 children in total. That evening, 9 of the children were at home. The family had finished their Christmas preparations. There were presents waiting. The house was warm, and there was nothing to suggest that the night would become one of the strangest missing person mysteries in American history. 5 of the children who were inside that house would never be seen again. Their names were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Maurice was 14. Martha was 12. Louis was 9. Jenny was 8. And Betty was only 5 years old. At the time, nobody in the Sodder family knew that these 5 children were spending their final known hours together. The family went to sleep believing that Christmas morning would arrive normally. But shortly after midnight, something happened. The telephone rang. Jenny Sodder answered. On the other end was a woman asking for someone the family did not recognize. Jenny explained that the caller had reached the wrong number. She hung up, but she could hear laughter and the sound of glasses in the background. It was strange. Still, a wrong number was not enough to make anyone panic. Jenny returned to bed. Before going back to sleep, she noticed something unusual downstairs. Several lights were still on. The curtains were open, and the front door was unlocked. She closed the curtains, locked the door, turned off the lights, and went back upstairs. The house became quiet again, for a short time. Then Jenny heard something. A loud sound struck the roof. A sharp bang. Afterward came a rolling noise. She did not know what had caused it. There was no reason to believe that it was connected to anything dangerous. But roughly half an hour later, Jenny woke again. This time she smelled smoke. The house was on fire. The Sodder family suddenly woke to chaos. George and Jenny tried to understand where the fire had started. The flames were spreading rapidly. Smoke was filling the house, and the family had only minutes to escape. George managed to get outside with some of the children, but 5 of them were still upstairs. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. George tried to get back inside. He broke a window while attempting to reach them, badly cutting his arm. But the smoke and flames made it impossible to see clearly. The staircase had become inaccessible. The children upstairs were trapped. George needed another way to reach them. He remembered the ladder. It was normally kept outside the house, but when he went looking for it, it was gone. That was the first strange detail. The ladder was not where it was supposed to be. George then thought of another possibility. He owned coal trucks. If one of the trucks could be moved close enough to the house, perhaps he could climb onto it and reach an upstairs window. He tried, but neither truck would start. According to the family's later account, both vehicles had worked normally before the fire. Now, at the exact moment they were desperately needed, neither would start. George had almost no options left. He tried to reach the children from outside, but the fire continued spreading. Meanwhile, one of the surviving children ran to a neighbor's house to call for help. The local fire department was only a few miles away, but this was 1945. There were no modern emergency systems, no smartphones, no automated dispatch center. The emergency call did not produce the immediate response the family needed. A neighbor eventually drove into town and found the fire chief. A telephone chain was then used to contact the volunteer firefighters. By the time the firefighters arrived, the house was already almost completely destroyed. The Sodder home had burned rapidly. The fire department worked to deal with the remaining flames. But the house was gone, and 5 children were missing. George and Jenny believed the children had been trapped upstairs. They believed they had died in the fire. There was no reason, at that moment, to imagine anything else. But then something happened that would change the entire story. When the family searched the burned area, they did not find the remains of the 5 children. Not 1, not 2, not 5. Nothing that could clearly identify them. Authorities eventually concluded that the children had died in the fire. The official explanation was that the blaze was accidental, reportedly caused by faulty electrical wiring. Death certificates were issued. The case should have ended there. A terrible Christmas Eve tragedy. 5 children dead. A family devastated. A burned house. But George and Jenny could not accept the explanation. They began asking questions. If the children had died in the fire, where were their remains? Why had nobody found bones? Why had the fire spread so quickly? Why had the ladder disappeared? Why had both trucks failed to start? And what had caused the strange noise on the roof shortly before the fire? The more the parents thought about that night, the more unusual details they remembered. They began to wonder whether the fire had actually been an accident. What if someone had started it deliberately? What if the children had not been inside when the fire began? And what if the fire had been used to hide something? These were theories. They were not proven facts. But George and Jenny refused to stop asking questions. The family later remembered other strange events from the months before the fire. A stranger had once visited their home and asked George about hauling work. The man reportedly walked around the property and looked closely at the electrical system. Then he made an unsettling comment about the house eventually having a fire. Another man had tried to sell George life insurance. When George refused, the conversation reportedly became angry. The man allegedly threatened that the house would burn and the children would be destroyed. George had been outspoken about his dislike of Benito Mussolini. The Sodder family was part of Fayetteville's Italian-American community, and George sometimes expressed strong political opinions. The family later wondered whether his opinions could have made enemies. But again, these details became part of the family's theory after the fire. They did not prove who caused it. Still, the questions continued. Then came another strange detail. A telephone repairman reportedly examined the family's telephone line and concluded that it appeared to have been cut rather than simply damaged by the fire. If true, that would be significant, because if someone deliberately disabled the telephone before the fire, it could explain why the family struggled to call for help. But this detail has also been debated over the years, and that is important when telling the story. The Sodder children case contains many claims, theories, and eyewitness accounts. Some were documented, others were reported later, and some remain impossible to verify completely. So investigators had to separate what was known from what the family believed. What was known was simple. A house burned on Christmas Eve. 5 children disappeared, and their remains were not conclusively recovered from the scene. Everything else became a question. George and Jenny were not prepared to let those questions disappear. They began investigating themselves. They spoke with witnesses. They followed leads. They contacted authorities. And eventually, they began publicly asking one terrifying question. What happened to their children? Were they really killed in the fire? Had someone kidnapped them? Had the fire been deliberately started? Or was there another explanation that nobody had considered? For the Sodder family, Christmas would never be the same again. And for the rest of America, the story would slowly become one of the strangest mysteries of the 20th century. A family home, a Christmas Eve fire, 5 missing children, and no clear explanation. The answers, if they existed, were hidden somewhere in the ashes. But the Sodder family was about to discover that finding those answers would take far longer than they ever imagined. By the time the sun came up over Fayetteville, the Sodder home was gone. What had once been a family house was now a blackened shell. The Christmas presents that had been waiting for the children were gone. The rooms where the family had lived, eaten, and slept were destroyed, and 5 children were missing. For George and Jenny Sodder, the morning did not feel real. They had spent the night trying to escape the flames and reach their children. Now they stood outside what remained of their home, trying to understand how such a terrible thing could have happened. At first, the explanation seemed straightforward. A fire had destroyed the house. The 5 children upstairs had apparently been unable to escape. It was a tragedy, but as the family began examining what remained, disturbing questions started appearing. Where were the children's remains? If 5 children had been trapped inside the house, surely something should have been found. Fragments of bone, Teeth. Something that could establish that they had died there. But nothing was immediately found. The family searched through the ruins. They looked through the ashes. They searched the areas where the children's bedrooms had been. But the expected remains were not there. George could not understand it. He had lived through fires before. He knew that fire could destroy almost everything. But the complete absence of identifiable remains troubled him. Still, the authorities believed the children had died. The fire had been intense. The house had burned quickly. And in 1945, forensic fire investigations were far less advanced than they are today. There was no modern DNA testing available. There was no way to compare unidentified remains with family members. And there was no sophisticated system for determining exactly what had happened to every person inside a burning building. The family, therefore, had to face the possibility that their children were gone. But George did not feel certain. Something about the situation felt wrong. The first question was the fire itself. How had it started? The official explanation eventually pointed toward an electrical problem. But George questioned that explanation. He remembered the strange noise from the roof. He remembered the missing ladder. He remembered the trucks that would not start. And he remembered the telephone problem. Individually, each detail could potentially have an innocent explanation. Together, they seemed much harder for him to accept. George began wondering whether the fire had been deliberately started. And if it had been deliberate, perhaps the children had not been killed in the fire at all. Perhaps someone had taken them. It was an extraordinary possibility, but George could not ignore it. He and Jenny began asking everyone who had been near the house that night what they had seen. One of the most important questions concerned the telephone. The family had tried to call for help, but the telephone did not work. If the line had simply failed because of the fire, that would have been understandable. But if the line had been cut beforehand, the situation would be very different. A deliberately disabled telephone could have prevented the family from calling for help quickly. That possibility disturbed George. Then there was the ladder. It had been stored outside the house. But after the fire began, it could not be found. Where had it gone? Had it been destroyed by the fire? Had it fallen somewhere? Or had someone moved it? Nobody could provide a satisfying answer. The trucks created another mystery. George had tried to start them during the emergency. Neither vehicle would start. For a man who depended on those trucks for his work, this was extremely strange. He believed they had been working normally. Could both have developed problems at exactly the same time? It was possible, but George did not believe it. He began to suspect that someone had deliberately interfered with the vehicles. If the ladder had been removed, the telephone disabled, and the trucks prevented from starting, then the family had been left with very few ways to rescue the children. That would mean the fire was not simply an accident. It would mean someone had planned it, but there was still no direct proof. And this is where the Sodder story becomes difficult. Some details were reported by the family. Some were later investigated. Some were disputed. And some could never be conclusively established. Over time, however, the family became convinced that their children had survived the fire. They believed the 5 children had been kidnapped. That belief would shape everything that happened afterward. George and Jenny began looking for evidence that their children had been taken. They contacted authorities. They spoke with witnesses. They searched for possible sightings. And they began paying attention to reports of children who resembled their missing sons and daughters. At first, there was little. The country was still recovering from the war. People were moving. Families were traveling. And communication between towns was much slower than it is today. A missing child could disappear across state lines without leaving the kind of digital trail investigators would have today. But the Sodders refused to give up. They wanted to believe that somewhere their children were alive. Then came a strange report. A woman claimed that she had seen the Sodder children after the fire. The details varied depending on the account, but the possibility was enough to keep the family searching. Other people later claimed to have seen children who resembled the missing siblings. Some sightings were investigated. Others could not be confirmed. Every possible sighting gave the parents another reason to hope, and hope could be both comforting and painful. Because every time a lead turned out to be false, the family was forced to experience the loss again. But they continued. The family began placing photographs of the missing children on posters. They wanted people to recognize them. They wanted anyone who had seen them to come forward. And eventually, the Sodder family took an extraordinary step. They placed a large billboard near the highway. 5 photographs looked down at passing motorists. The message was simple. The children were still missing. If anyone knew where they were, the family wanted to know. For years, the billboard became one of the most recognizable symbols of the case. The children's faces remained visible. Their names remained visible. And the question remained, what happened to them? George and Jenny did not believe the case should be closed. They continued arguing that the children had been kidnapped, and they began examining the events surrounding the fire more closely. One detail particularly troubled them. The fire had destroyed the house very quickly. According to later accounts, the building was already heavily engulfed when help arrived. Could that have been intentional? Could an accelerant have been used? There was no modern fire scene technology available to settle the question. And because the house had burned so severely, determining the exact cause was extremely difficult. The family believed the fire had been set. But the official explanation remained that the fire was accidental. That disagreement would continue for years. Then another strange report appeared. A witness claimed to have seen someone in the area around the time of the fire. The details were unclear, but the family began wondering whether a stranger had been watching their house. This connected with an earlier incident involving a man who had reportedly visited the Sodder property. He had allegedly tried to sell George life insurance. George had refused. The conversation reportedly became angry. The man allegedly made a threatening remark about the house and the children. If that account was accurate, it was disturbing, but it still did not prove that the man had anything to do with the fire. Investigators would have to determine whether the threat had been serious or simply an angry comment. And even if the man had threatened the family, there would still need to be evidence connecting him to the fire. The same problem appeared again and again. The family had clues, but clues were not answers. And every time they thought they had found something important, another question appeared. What about the children themselves? If they had been kidnapped, why? Who would want 5 children? Why would anyone take them? And why would the person risk being seen? A kidnapping involving 5 children would have been difficult to conceal. Someone would have had to transport them. Someone would have had to feed them. Someone would have had to explain their presence. And yet no confirmed trail ever emerged. That made the kidnapping theory difficult to prove. But the absence of proof did not convince George and Jenny to stop looking. They had one thing the authorities did not: a reason to believe their children might still be alive. That belief kept them searching, and eventually, another piece of information would deepen the mystery. A man contacted the family and claimed to have information about the children. The details of these later reports varied. Some people claimed the children had been seen in different states. Others believed the children had been taken by someone who knew the family. And some theories suggested the children had been kidnapped as part of a deliberate plan. The problem was that none of these theories could be conclusively established. The family followed leads anyway, because when 5 children disappear, you do not simply stop looking. You keep looking, even when the evidence is weak, even when the trail is cold, even when everyone tells you that the children are gone. George and Jenny continued to believe that something had happened beyond the fire. Their persistence eventually attracted public attention. Newspapers began covering the mystery. The family's photographs appeared in advertisements, and the case became known far beyond Fayetteville. People across the country began hearing about the 5 missing children. The story was unusual enough to capture attention. A Christmas Eve fire, 5 missing children, no confirmed remains. A family convinced that the official explanation was wrong. It was a mystery that seemed almost impossible, and the longer the children remained missing, the more questions were created. If they had died, where were the remains? If they survived, where were they? If someone kidnapped them, who? And if the fire had been deliberate, why? There was still no clear answer. Then, as the years passed, the Sodder family noticed something else. The case was not receiving the attention they believed it deserved. The official investigation had largely settled on the idea that the children had died. But George and Jenny refused to accept that conclusion. They believed the evidence had not been properly explained, and they continued searching. They hired investigators. They followed tips. They paid attention to letters, and they kept the children's photographs visible. The family would eventually spend decades trying to solve a mystery that began on one terrible Christmas Eve. But the next stage of the story would take them into an even stranger world. Because if the children had survived, there should have been evidence of them somewhere. A school record, a photograph, a witness, a name, a letter, something. And if they had been taken somewhere far away, somebody would eventually have to know. The Sodders began searching for that somebody. They were looking for any person who could tell them what happened after the fire. And they would eventually receive one of the strangest clues in the entire case. A photograph. A photograph that appeared years after the children disappeared. A photograph showing a young man who looked remarkably similar to one of the missing Sodder children. Was it really one of them? Or was it simply a coincidence? The answer would remain uncertain. But when the photograph reached the Sodder family, it gave them something they had not had in years. Hope. And that hope would keep the mystery alive for another generation. The Sodder family had spent years searching for answers. Every phone call could be a lead. Every letter could contain information. Every stranger who claimed to know something had to be taken seriously. But most leads ended the same way. They led nowhere. Then, years after the Christmas Eve fire, something arrived that was different. It was a photograph. A small photograph of a young man. At first glance, it might have looked like an ordinary picture. But when the Sodder family looked at it, they noticed something that immediately caught their attention. The young man looked remarkably similar to one of their missing children. The family studied the photograph again and again. The face, the hair, the shape of the eyes, the expression. To them, the resemblance was strong enough to raise a terrifying possibility. Could this be one of their children? Could one of the 5 children actually have survived the fire? The photograph became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire mystery. But it also created a new problem. A photograph can suggest something. It cannot prove it. The family needed to know who the young man really was. Where had the photograph been taken? Who had sent it? And most importantly, was the person in the photograph actually one of the missing Sodder children? There was no immediate answer. The photograph was not accompanied by a complete explanation. It became another mystery inside the larger mystery. George and Jenny studied it carefully. They compared the young man's features with photographs of their son. They looked at the ears, the nose, the eyes, the shape of the face. They believed the resemblance was striking, and because they had never accepted that their children had died in the fire, the photograph gave them another reason to continue searching. But investigators had to remain cautious. A resemblance between 2 people does not establish identity. People who are not related can sometimes look remarkably alike, and photographs can be affected by lighting, age, camera quality, and perspective. The young man in the photograph was older than the missing child. Years had passed. If the photograph really showed one of the Sodder children, he would naturally look different. But that also meant the comparison was difficult. How would a 9-year-old child look as a teenager? How would a 5-year-old girl look years later? There was no simple way to know. Still, the photograph kept the family's attention. They wanted to believe, and that belief became an important part of the family's continuing search. The children had disappeared in 1945. By the time this photograph appeared, the missing children would have been several years older. If they had survived, they would have grown up somewhere. They would have attended school. They would have met people. They would have developed new lives. Perhaps they had even been given different names. That possibility was both hopeful and frightening, because if the children had been kidnapped and raised elsewhere, they might not even know who they really were. But there was another possibility. Perhaps the photograph was simply a photograph of another young man. A coincidence, an innocent resemblance, and the family might have been seeing what they desperately wanted to see. That was the difficult part of the mystery. Hope can change the way people interpret evidence. When you lose someone, even a small possibility can feel enormous. A face in a photograph can become a lifeline. A stranger's story can become a potential answer. And a rumor can become something worth following across the country. The Sodders continued searching anyway. They did not want to dismiss any possibility. And the photograph was only one of many strange clues that would eventually become associated with the case. Another clue involved a report of a woman who claimed to have seen some of the children shortly after the fire. According to later accounts, she said she had seen them traveling with people who appeared to be strangers. The details were unclear, but again, the family followed the lead, because the question remained the same. What if the children survived? That possibility could not be proven, but neither could the family prove that they had died in the fire. The lack of remains remained deeply troubling to them, and this was one of the central arguments behind their belief. If 5 children had died in the fire, why had so little physical evidence been recovered? The answer could potentially be explained by the intensity of the fire, but the family believed there should have been something. They wanted investigators to reconsider the site. They wanted more evidence, and they wanted someone to explain what had happened. Over time, the family began investigating the fire itself. They questioned the official explanation. They believed the fire may have been deliberately started, and they wondered whether the missing ladder and failed trucks were connected. If someone had planned to prevent the family from rescuing the children, then those details would make sense. But if the fire had been accidental, then each detail would require another explanation. The ladder could have been moved, the trucks could have malfunctioned, the telephone could have failed, and the strange noise could have been something unrelated. None of those possibilities was impossible, but the family did not find them convincing. Their belief became stronger. They believed someone had taken their children, and they wanted the world to believe it too. The family eventually placed a large billboard along a highway. 5 photographs stared down at passing motorists. The billboard became a symbol of the mystery. It was impossible to miss. 5 children, 5 faces, 5 names, and a family still asking where they were. The billboard also changed the public's relationship with the case. People across the region began recognizing the children. Travelers saw the photographs. Drivers read the message, and the mystery became part of the public consciousness. That created more tips. Some people claimed they had seen one of the children. Others claimed they had information about the fire. Most leads could not be confirmed, but the family continued. They followed every reasonable possibility. They contacted investigators. They searched records, and they kept the photographs alive. Years passed. The children would have grown older. Maurice would have become a young adult. Martha would have grown into a teenager. Louis would have become a young man. Jenny and Betty would have grown up. If they were alive, that phrase became important. If they were alive, nobody could prove it, but nobody could completely eliminate it either. And that uncertainty made the Sodder case different from an ordinary missing person case. There was no confirmed body, no confirmed grave, no confirmed survivor, only absence. 5 people simply disappeared from the historical record after the fire. That left an enormous space for theories. Some people believed the children had been kidnapped. Some believed the family had been mistaken about the remains. Some believed the fire itself had destroyed the evidence. Others believed there had been a deliberate conspiracy. And some people believed the children had died exactly as the authorities concluded. The mystery survived because none of these explanations could completely satisfy everyone. Then another strange event occurred. The family received a letter. The contents were disturbing. The letter appeared to suggest that the writer knew something about the missing children. The family believed it might contain a clue, but like many pieces of evidence in the case, its meaning was uncertain. Who had written it? Why had they sent it? Did they actually know where the children were? Or was someone simply trying to exploit the family's grief? That last possibility was always present. When a family is desperate for information, someone can take advantage of that desperation. They can demand money. They can provide false information. They can create fake sightings. And they can prolong a mystery. The Sodders had to consider that possibility. But they also had to consider the possibility that someone genuinely knew something. That uncertainty made every lead difficult. They could not ignore it, but they could not trust it blindly either. The family continued searching, and as the years passed, the original investigation became more distant. The people who had worked the case in 1945 were aging. Records were becoming harder to locate. Memories were fading, and the physical evidence was no longer easily available. This was a problem. Cold cases become harder with time. Witnesses die. Documents disappear. Places change. And evidence can deteriorate. The Sodders, however, refused to let the case disappear. They kept the photographs. They kept the billboard. And they kept asking questions. For them, the 5 children were not a historical mystery. They were their family. That difference explains why they continued long after many people would have stopped. Then another development gave the family reason to believe that someone might actually have known what happened. A man reportedly claimed that he had information about the children. He suggested they had been seen after the fire. The details were never firmly established, but the family followed the lead. Again and again, this became a pattern. A new clue appeared. Hope returned. The family investigated. Then the lead failed, and the cycle repeated. For George and Jenny, the emotional cost must have been enormous. Every new lead carried the possibility of finding their children, and every failed lead meant facing the loss again. Yet they continued. The case also began attracting people who were fascinated by mysteries. Some were genuine investigators. Others were simply curious. And over the years, more theories developed. Some focused on George's political views. Others focused on business disputes. Some suggested organized crime. Others believed the fire had been an accident, and the missing remains were simply a result of the destruction. Each theory tried to explain the same strange collection of facts, but none could answer everything, and that is what made the case so difficult. The mystery was not simply, where did the children go? It was, what happened during the final minutes before the house burned? If the fire was accidental, why did the other details seem suspicious? If the children were kidnapped, why was there so little evidence? If they died in the fire, why were their remains not conclusively recovered? Every explanation created another question, and that was why the Sodder family never felt satisfied with the official conclusion. They wanted evidence, not assumptions, not possibilities, evidence. They wanted to know exactly what happened. As the years passed, the family became older. The missing children remained frozen in time. The photographs showed them as they had been in 1945. But the world around them continued changing. New technology appeared. New generations grew up. And the case became a historical mystery. Yet the billboard remained a reminder. The 5 children were still missing, and the family was still searching. Eventually, George Sodder died. He had spent decades believing that his children might have survived. He never received a definitive answer. Jenny continued to carry the mystery. The family continued to preserve the evidence, and the photographs remained. For the Sodder family, the story did not end with George's death. It continued through the next generation. Children who had never known the missing siblings personally still knew their names. They knew the story. They knew the photographs. And they knew that the family had never accepted the official explanation. The case had become part of the family's history. But one question remained especially important. Could the photograph of the young man actually have been one of the missing children? There was never a definitive answer. No DNA test confirmed it. No independent record established his identity as one of the Sodder children. And that meant the photograph remained what it had always been. A clue. A possibility. Nothing more. But sometimes a clue does not need to solve a case to change it. The photograph changed the way people looked at the mystery. It gave the family a reason to keep believing. And it gave the public another question. What if the children really had survived? That question would follow the case for decades. But eventually, another piece of evidence would emerge. Something even stranger. Something that appeared to suggest that the children might have been seen years after the fire. And this time, the clue would not simply be a photograph. It would be a message. A message that would make the Sodder family wonder whether someone, somewhere, actually knew the truth. The mystery was becoming deeper. And the family's search was about to take another unexpected turn. The Sodder family had spent years living with the same question. Were the 5 children really killed in the fire? For George and Jenny, the answer had never felt certain. They knew their children had been inside the house when the fire began, but they had never seen their bodies, and the search of the burned home had produced almost nothing that could conclusively identify the children. Authorities believed the fire had destroyed the remains, while the family continued to believe that something else had happened. That disagreement would shape the rest of their lives. The family did not simply wait for someone else to solve the mystery. They began searching themselves. Every possible sighting mattered. Every unusual letter mattered. Every stranger who claimed to know something had to be considered. The first reports came from people who believed they had seen the children after the fire. One woman claimed she had seen several children looking out from a passing car while the fire was still burning. Another woman, who operated a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, later told authorities that she had seen the children the morning after the fire. According to her account, the children were at the tourist court with other people, and she remembered a car with Florida license plates. For George and Jenny, that kind of report was impossible to ignore. If the children had really been seen the next morning, then everything changed. They might not have died inside the house. They might have been taken somewhere. They might still be alive. But there was a problem. The reports could not be independently confirmed. The people who claimed to have seen the children could remember what they believed they had seen, but there was no photograph or other definitive evidence proving that the children were actually the Sodder siblings. Still, the family followed the leads. They had no choice. For parents who had lost 5 children without finding their remains, uncertainty could be almost as painful as grief itself. Then another report came. A woman in Charleston said she had seen 4 of the children about a week after the fire. She described a group that included 2 men and 2 women. According to her statement, the adults appeared to be Italian, and the children were staying with them at a hotel. She said the adults were unusually protective of the children and prevented her from speaking with them. The group reportedly left the following morning. It was an extraordinary claim. If true, it could mean that at least 4 of the missing children had survived. But there was still no way to prove it. The family could not simply travel back in time and identify the children. Photographs existed, but children change quickly as they grow. A child seen at one age may look very different only a few years later. And the longer the search continued, the harder identification became. Still, George and Jenny kept going. They began to realize that their search might have to continue far beyond West Virginia. They started watching newspapers. They looked at photographs. They paid attention to reports of missing or unidentified children. And they followed rumors across state lines. The family even became willing to travel long distances when they believed a sighting might be genuine. At one point, George saw a newspaper photograph of school children in New York City. One of the children looked enough like his daughter Betty that he became convinced he needed to investigate. He traveled to New York, but the family of the child refused to speak with him. The lead ended there. For someone else, that might have been enough to stop. For George, it was simply another unanswered possibility. The search continued. The family also began publicly asking people to help. They created flyers. They distributed photographs. And eventually, they put up a large billboard along Route 16 near Fayetteville. 5 children's faces appeared on it. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Their ages were listed beneath their photographs. The message asked a question that would become permanently associated with the case. What was their fate? Were they kidnapped? Were they murdered? Or were they still alive? The billboard remained visible for decades. For people driving through the area, the 5 children's faces became familiar. The family wanted the public to remember them. They wanted someone who knew something to come forward, and they wanted anyone who had seen the children after the fire to contact them. A reward was also offered. The amount eventually reached $10,000. For the Sodders, this was not simply a publicity campaign. It was another attempt to bring their children home, or at least to discover what had happened to them. But the investigation was becoming more complicated. The official position remained that the children had died. The family believed they had survived, and neither side could completely settle the question. Then, in 1947, George and Jenny took another major step. They contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At the time, Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI. The Sodders hoped federal investigators could examine the possibility that their children had been kidnapped. The FBI responded that the matter appeared to be local, and therefore outside the Bureau's investigative jurisdiction, unless local authorities requested assistance. The local authorities did not provide the necessary authorization, so the FBI investigation never developed into the federal search the Sodders had hoped for. For George and Jenny, that must have been another disappointment. They believed something was wrong. They believed the official investigation had failed to answer basic questions, and now even the federal government was not taking over the case. But they did not stop. Instead, they hired a private investigator. His name was C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley began looking into the circumstances surrounding the fire, and according to later accounts, he discovered information that made the family even more suspicious. One of the details involved the insurance salesman who had allegedly threatened George before the fire. Tinsley reportedly learned that the man had connections to the local coroner's investigation. If that was true, it raised an uncomfortable question. Could someone connected to the family have influenced the official conclusion? The family began to suspect that the fire investigation itself might have been compromised. But again, suspicion was not proof. The investigator could find unusual relationships. He could uncover strange circumstances. But he could not automatically establish that someone had kidnapped the children. Another disturbing story also emerged. According to later accounts, the fire chief reportedly claimed that some human remains had been discovered. The family eventually heard that a box containing what was supposedly an organ had been buried at the site. When they recovered the material, however, it was reportedly identified as beef liver. That story only deepened their distrust. Was the object genuinely mistaken for human remains? Had someone planted it? Or had the entire story been misunderstood over time? There was no definitive answer. The Sodders continued to believe that the investigation had not been handled properly. And the more they investigated, the more they questioned the official version. The fire itself became the center of their suspicions. They believed it may have been deliberately started. They pointed to the missing ladder. They pointed to the trucks that would not start. They pointed to the telephone problem. They pointed to the strange sound on the roof. And they remembered the threatening remarks that had been made before the fire. Taken together, these details convinced the family that the fire could not simply have been an accident. But investigators had another explanation. A fire can behave unpredictably. A wooden house can burn rapidly. Electrical failures can produce fires. And the presence of fuel, gasoline, and other materials around the property could potentially increase the intensity of a blaze. The problem was that the original investigation did not leave behind enough evidence to settle every question decades later. The fire was already gone. The house was destroyed, and much of the physical evidence was lost. The family could only reconstruct the night from memories. That made the mystery even harder. Then in 1949, the Sodders decided to search the site again. They were no longer satisfied with the original examination. They wanted another look. They brought in a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter. This time, the search was much more thorough. The family hoped that if human remains had survived, they would finally be found. The excavation uncovered several small objects. There were damaged coins, a partially burned dictionary, and most importantly, several pieces of bone. For the first time since the fire, the family had something that might actually be connected to the missing children. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for examination. This was the moment the Sodders had been waiting for. If the bones belonged to one of the children, then the kidnapping theory could collapse. The official explanation could finally be supported. Or perhaps the examination would reveal something completely unexpected. The Smithsonian experts studied the bones. Their conclusion was surprising. The bones were identified as 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Based on the development of the bones, the person was estimated to have been around 16 or 17 years old, with an upper estimate of approximately 22. The oldest missing Sodder child, Maurice, had been 14. The Smithsonian report said that the bone development was more advanced than expected for a 14-year-old, although it acknowledged that such development was possible in a 14-and-a-half-year-old boy. But there was another detail that caught attention. The bones reportedly showed no evidence of having been exposed to fire. That was extraordinary. If the bones had come from the burned house, why did they show no signs of burning? And why had only 4 vertebrae been discovered? The Smithsonian report noted that it was unusual that no other bones were found during the excavation. The report suggested that, given the circumstances, investigators might expect considerably more skeletal material if the bones belonged to the children. The possibility was raised that the vertebrae had not actually come from the fire. Instead, they may have been part of the dirt George had used to fill the basement after the fire. For the Sodders, this was another confusing development. The bones did not provide the clear answer they wanted. They could not confidently identify them as belonging to one of the missing children, and they did not establish that the children had survived. Instead, the mystery became even deeper. The family continued to believe the children had been taken. Authorities continued to believe they had died. Neither side had a definitive answer. The case reached the attention of state officials. There were hearings. The family's concerns were discussed. But ultimately, authorities considered the search hopeless and treated the case as closed. For most families, that might have been the end. For the Sodders, it was only another chapter. They continued displaying the billboard. They continued offering the reward. They continued following tips. And they continued hoping that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened. Then the tips became increasingly strange. One woman wrote claiming that Martha, one of the missing girls, was living in a convent in St. Louis. Another report came from Texas. Someone in a bar reportedly claimed to have overheard a conversation about the Christmas Eve fire. Another person in Florida claimed the children were staying with a distant relative of Jenny's. George followed these leads. He traveled. He investigated. He asked questions. And each time, he returned without his children. But the family refused to give up. The billboard remained. The photographs remained. And the question remained. What happened to the 5 Sodder children? Then, more than 20 years after the fire, one of the strangest clues of all arrived. It came in the form of an envelope. The envelope was postmarked in Kentucky. Inside was a photograph. A young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, looked directly into the camera. The family studied his face. They believed they recognized something. The dark curly hair, the dark eyes, the shape of the nose, the angle of the eyebrow. To George and Jenny, the young man looked remarkably similar to their son Louis, who had been only 9 years old when he disappeared. Then they looked at the back of the photograph. There was handwriting, a short message. It appeared to identify the man as Louis Sodder. The message also included the words, "I love Brother Frankie." And then there were additional characters that were difficult to understand. The photograph created another wave of hope. Could Louis have survived? Could he have grown up somewhere else? Could someone have taken him and raised him under another identity? The family did not know. But they did what they had done for years. They investigated. They hired another private investigator. They sent him toward Kentucky. And then something strange happened. The investigator disappeared from the story. The family never heard from him again. They were left with the photograph. And more questions. If the photograph really showed Louis, where was he? Who had taken the photograph? Who had sent it? And why? If it was not Louis, why had someone sent it to the Sodders? Could it have been a cruel hoax? Or was someone genuinely trying to tell them something? The family was afraid to release every detail publicly. They worried that if Louis really was alive, publicity could put him in danger. So instead, they updated the billboard. The photograph of the older man was added. The message remained. The family was still asking the same question. But now they had a face from decades later. A face that might belong to a child who had supposedly died in 1945. There was still no scientific confirmation. No DNA test. No official identification. No independent evidence proving that the young man was Louis. But the photograph became one of the most enduring mysteries connected to the case. And for the Sodders, it represented something more powerful than evidence. It represented possibility. The possibility that at least one of their children had survived. And if Louis had survived, perhaps the others had too. Perhaps the fire had been a cover. Perhaps the children had been taken. Perhaps someone knew where they were. The family would spend the rest of their lives wondering. George would eventually die in 1969. He never received the answer he wanted. Jenny continued searching until her death in 1989. The billboard remained until shortly before her death. And even after the parents were gone, their children and grandchildren continued trying to understand what happened. The mystery had passed from one generation to another. But there was still one question hanging over everything. If the 5 children had survived the fire, why had none of them ever returned home? And if they had died, why had the physical evidence been so difficult to explain? That question would become the heart of the Sodder mystery. And in the next chapter, we will follow the clues that appeared after the family had already spent years searching. Because the strangest part of the story was not that people claimed to have seen the children. It was that some of those claims seemed to place them far away from the burning house. For most families, the disappearance of 5 children would have been impossible to accept. For George and Jenny Sodder, it became the central question of their lives. They had been told that their children had died in the fire, but they had never been given the kind of physical evidence that could bring certainty. And as the years passed, reports continued to appear suggesting that the children might have been seen after Christmas Eve. Some reports were probably mistakes. Some may have been rumors, and some could have been deliberate hoaxes. But for a family that had never found their children, every lead carried a possibility. The first major problem was the question of the fire itself. The official explanation was that faulty wiring had caused the blaze. A state police inspector attributed the fire to an electrical problem, and death certificates were eventually issued for the 5 missing children. George and Jenny disagreed. They remembered the telephone. They remembered the missing ladder. They remembered the trucks. And they remembered the strange sound that Jenny had heard shortly before the fire. Individually, those details might have had innocent explanations. But together, they made the family suspicious. George believed someone could have deliberately prevented the family from escaping or calling for help. That theory became even stronger in his mind when a telephone repairman reportedly told the family that their telephone line appeared to have been cut rather than burned. If that was accurate, it raised an obvious question. Why would someone cut the telephone line? And when? Before the fire? During the fire? Or afterward? There was no definitive answer. But the possibility was enough to keep George searching. Another strange detail involved the ladder. George normally kept a ladder outside the house. When the fire began, he needed it desperately. But it was missing. Without it, reaching the upstairs windows became much more difficult. George then tried using one of his coal trucks. If he could get a truck close enough to the house, he might be able to climb onto it and reach the children. But neither truck would start. According to the family's account, both had been working before the fire. Again, there could have been an innocent explanation. Old vehicles could fail. Electrical systems could malfunction. A battery could suddenly die. But George believed the timing was too suspicious. He wondered whether someone had deliberately disabled the vehicles. That possibility changed the way he looked at the entire night. What if the fire had been designed to prevent the family from rescuing the children? What if the people responsible had planned the escape? And what if the fire was not the real crime? Perhaps it had been a distraction. Perhaps the children had been removed from the house. Perhaps someone wanted everyone to believe they had died. That became the theory the family would spend years investigating. But there was still a major problem. If the children had been kidnapped, where were they? The country was large. The children could have been transported across state lines. And in 1945, there was nothing like today's network of cameras, smartphones, digital records, and electronic payments. A person could travel hundreds of miles without leaving the kind of trail investigators would expect today. That made the family's search extremely difficult. Still, they continued. One of the most interesting reports came from a woman operating a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston. She later told police that she had seen the children the morning after the fire. She reportedly remembered serving them breakfast. There was also a car with Florida license plates at the location. If the children really were there, it would mean they had survived the fire and left Fayetteville almost immediately. But there was no confirmed record proving that the children were the ones she saw. The report therefore remained a lead. Nothing more. Another woman in Charleston later claimed that she had seen 4 of the children about a week after the fire. She said they were with 2 men and 2 women. The adults appeared to be Italian. The group reportedly stayed at a hotel before leaving early the next morning. The woman remembered trying to speak with the children, but according to her statement, the men prevented her from talking to them. Again, this was an extraordinary claim. For missing children, 2 men, 2 women, a hotel, a strange encounter, and then the group disappeared. If the story was accurate, it could have been a major breakthrough. But there was no independent confirmation, no photographs, no records that could conclusively identify the children, no evidence that the group was connected to the Sodders. So the family had another lead, but not another answer. That distinction became a painful part of their lives. The children might be alive, or they might be dead. Every new report could move the family toward one possibility. Then another piece of information could pull them back toward the other. The uncertainty never ended, and the family began looking outside West Virginia. They watched newspapers from other states. They looked for children who resembled the missing siblings. They contacted people who claimed to have information, and they followed rumors wherever they led. One of those rumors eventually took George to New York. He had seen a newspaper photograph of school children. One of the children looked enough like his daughter Betty that George believed he had to investigate. He traveled to Manhattan, but the parents of the child refused to speak with him. The lead ended there. For George, it was another disappointment, but it also demonstrated how far he was willing to go. He would travel hundreds of miles if there was even a small possibility that one of his children had survived. Then came another important step. In 1947, George and Jenny contacted the FBI. They hoped federal investigators might be able to investigate the possibility that their children had been kidnapped. But the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, replied that the matter appeared to be local and did not fall within the Bureau's investigative jurisdiction. The Bureau indicated that it could assist if local authorities authorized it. That authorization did not happen. The federal investigation never developed. For the Sodders, this was another door closing. They had tried local authorities. They had questioned the fire. They had followed sightings. Now they had reached out to the federal government. Still, the mystery remained. So they hired a private investigator. His name was C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley began examining the circumstances surrounding the fire, and his investigation reportedly uncovered information that made the family even more suspicious. One detail involved the insurance salesman who had allegedly threatened George before the fire. According to later reporting, Tinsley discovered that the man had been connected to the coroner's jury that considered the fire accidental. The family saw this as suspicious. But once again, suspicion was not proof. A person can have an unusual connection to an investigation without being responsible for a crime. Still, the information strengthened the family's belief that the original investigation had not been handled properly. Another story concerned the fire chief. According to accounts repeated later, the fire chief reportedly claimed that he had found what appeared to be a human organ among the ashes. The object was supposedly placed inside a box and buried at the scene. When the Sodders learned about it, they recovered the box. The object was reportedly examined by a funeral director, who concluded that it was beef liver. The story became one of the strangest pieces of the entire investigation. Was the object really mistaken for human remains? Had it been placed there afterward? Or had the story changed as it was repeated over the years? There is no definitive answer. But for the Sodders, it was another reason to distrust the official handling of the case. They continued believing that the investigation had been too quick to conclude that the children were dead. Then came one of the most important developments. The family decided to search the burned property again. This happened in 1949, for years after the fire. They brought in a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter. The search was more thorough than the original examination. Small objects were recovered from the site. Among them were damaged coins, a partially burned dictionary, and several pieces of vertebrae. For the first time, the family had something that could potentially answer their biggest question. Were these the remains of one of the children? The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for examination. The result did not give the family the certainty they wanted. The Smithsonian identified 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. The estimated age was around 16 or 17, with an upper estimate around 22. The oldest missing Sodder child, Maurice, had been 14. The report noted that the bones showed greater skeletal development than would normally be expected for a 14-year-old, although it acknowledged that such development was possible in a boy around 14 and a half. That was important, because if the bones were from the fire, they did not provide a straightforward identification of the missing children. And there was another problem. The bones showed no clear signs that they had been burned. That created another question. If they had been inside a house that burned so intensely, why did the bones not appear to have been exposed to the fire? The Smithsonian report suggested that the vertebrae may have come from the dirt that George had used to fill the basement after the fire, rather than from the remains of the children. The report also noted that finding only 4 vertebrae without other expected skeletal material was unusual. For the family, this did not settle anything. It simply created another mystery. The authorities continued to believe the children had died. The Sodders continued to believe they had disappeared. Eventually, state officials told the family that their search was hopeless and considered the case closed. But George and Jenny refused to accept that. They had spent years searching. They had followed reports across the country. They had contacted the FBI. They had hired investigators. And now they had even searched the ruins again. Still, they did not have an answer. So they did something extraordinary. They put the children's faces on a billboard. 5 photographs, 5 names, 5 children who had disappeared on Christmas Eve. The billboard stood near Route 16 outside Fayetteville. For people driving through the area, the children's faces became impossible to ignore. The message asked, what was their fate? Were they kidnapped? Were they murdered? Or were they still alive? The family offered a reward for information. The amount eventually reached $10,000. The billboard remained for decades. It became a permanent reminder that the Sodder family did not believe the story was over. And then the tips started coming. A woman in St. Louis claimed that Martha, one of the missing girls, was in a convent. Someone in Texas reportedly claimed to have overheard a conversation about the fire. Another person in Florida claimed that the children were staying with a distant relative. George followed these leads. He traveled, he investigated, and every time he returned home without the children. But the family kept going, because one thing had changed. They were no longer simply waiting for authorities. They had become investigators themselves. Every photograph was examined. Every rumor was considered. Every possible sighting was followed. And the family began building a private archive of information about their missing children. The photographs became especially important, because the longer the children remained missing, the older they would become. A photograph from 1945 showed how they looked as children. But what would they look like at 18? At 20? At 25? If they were alive, they would no longer look like the faces on the original billboard. That meant identification would become increasingly difficult. A child could grow into an adult who looked completely different. And if someone had deliberately changed their identity, the problem would become even greater. This possibility made the family's search almost impossible. But it also made every later photograph potentially important. And eventually, one photograph would arrive that would become perhaps the most famous clue in the entire Sodder mystery. It would appear more than 20 years after the fire. By then, George and Jenny had already spent decades wondering what happened. They had heard countless stories. They had seen false leads. They had experienced disappointment after disappointment. Then an envelope arrived. It had been mailed from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man. He appeared to be in his mid-20s. And when Jenny looked at the face, she immediately noticed something. The young man looked remarkably similar to her missing son. Louis Sodder. Louis had been only 9 years old when he disappeared. The young man in the photograph was much older. But the family believed certain features looked strikingly similar. The dark hair, the dark eyes, the nose, the eyebrow, and the general shape of the face. Then they turned the photograph over. On the back was a handwritten message. It appeared to identify the young man as Louis. It also contained the words, "I love Brother Frankie." There were additional letters and numbers that were difficult to understand. Suddenly, the family had another question. Could this actually be Louis? If it was, then one of the 5 children had survived. And if Louis survived, what had happened to the others? Were they alive too? Had someone taken them? Had they been separated? Or had Louis somehow escaped while the others died? The photograph did not answer any of those questions. But it gave the family something they had almost lost. Hope. They hired another private investigator. They sent him to Kentucky to investigate the photograph. And then the investigator stopped communicating. The family never heard from him again. That only made the mystery stranger. If the photograph was meaningless, why had someone sent it? If it was genuine, why was there no clear trail? And who had written the message? The family decided not to publish every detail. They feared that if Louis really was alive, public attention could put him at risk. Instead, they updated the billboard. The older photograph was added. The missing child was now shown not only as the 9-year-old boy who had disappeared in 1945, but as the young man he might have become. The message remained the same. What was his fate? George would continue wondering. He would never receive the answer. He died in 1969, more than 2 decades after the fire. He had spent his final years believing that his children might still be somewhere. The mystery remained unsolved. Jenny continued searching until her own death in 1989. The billboard finally came down around the time of her death. But the story did not end with George and Jenny. Their surviving children and grandchildren continued to think about the case. They developed their own theories. Some believed the children had been kidnapped. Some suspected people connected to the local Italian community. Others believed someone had deliberately started the fire to hide the kidnapping. But there was never enough evidence to establish one explanation as fact. And that is where the Sodder mystery remains today. A fire destroyed a home. 5 children disappeared. Their remains were never conclusively identified. Possible sightings appeared. A mysterious photograph surfaced decades later, and a family spent the rest of its life searching. But perhaps the most haunting question is still the simplest. If the children died in the fire, where are the remains? And if they survived, where did they go? Those two possibilities have followed the Sodder family for generations. And in the next chapter, we will look more closely at the evidence surrounding the fire itself. Because the mystery may not begin with the children disappearing. It may begin with the question of how the house caught fire in the first place. The more the Sodder family looked back at that Christmas Eve, the less ordinary the fire seemed to them. The official explanation was simple. Faulty electrical wiring had caused the blaze. The house had burned rapidly. 5 children had supposedly been trapped upstairs, and the fire had destroyed their remains. For authorities, that explanation was enough. For George and Jenny, it was not. They remembered the condition of the house before the fire. They remembered that the electrical system had reportedly been inspected not long before the tragedy. And they could not understand how 5 children could disappear without leaving identifiable remains. But the fire itself contained other details that continued to bother them. One of the most important was the telephone. During the emergency, the family tried to call for help, but the telephone was not working. Later, according to accounts from the family, a telephone repairman examined the line and said it appeared to have been cut rather than simply damaged by the fire. If that was true, it created an obvious question. Who had cut it? And when? If the line had been cut before the fire, someone may have wanted to prevent the family from calling for help. If it had been damaged during the fire, then there was a much simpler explanation. But the family never felt satisfied with the first possibility. Then there was the latter. George desperately needed it when he realized that the children were trapped upstairs. But the ladder was gone. Later, it was reportedly found down an embankment some distance from the house. That detail disturbed George. A ladder normally kept near the house did not simply explain itself. Had it fallen? Had someone moved it? Or had someone deliberately placed it away from the house? Again, there was no definitive answer. The trucks created another strange problem. George owned 2 vehicles that he used for his work. During the fire, he tried to start them so he could use one to reach an upstairs window. Neither would start. To George, the timing seemed almost impossible. He believed the trucks had been working before the fire. Why would both fail at the exact moment he needed them? One possible explanation was mechanical failure. Another was that someone had interfered with them. The family eventually heard a report that a witness had seen a man near the property taking a block and tackle device used for lifting engines from vehicles. If true, that could potentially explain why the trucks had become unusable. But again, the report was not enough to establish who the man was or what he intended. The clues were beginning to form a pattern in the family's mind. The telephone, the ladder, the trucks, the rapid fire, the missing children, and the absence of identifiable remains. George began asking himself a frightening question. What if all of these things were connected? What if someone had deliberately created a situation in which the children could not be rescued? The theory was terrifying, but it also seemed to explain several details at once. The family began to believe that the fire might have been a distraction, something designed to make everyone believe the children had died. And if that were true, then perhaps the real crime had happened before the house burned. Perhaps the children had been taken. But who would do such a thing? That was where the investigation became much more complicated. Before the fire, George had been involved in arguments with people. He had strong political opinions. He was outspoken about Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism. The Sodders were part of Fayetteville's Italian-American community. George's opinions were known. The family later wondered whether he had made enemies because of them. But there was no proven connection between his political views and the disappearance of the children. It was simply another possibility, another theory, another unanswered question. There was also the insurance salesman. Before the fire, a man had reportedly tried to sell George additional life insurance. George refused. According to the family's account, the man became angry and made a threatening statement involving the house and the children. That statement became extremely important in the family's later suspicions. But a threat made during an argument is not proof of murder. Investigators still needed to establish whether the man had anything to do with the fire, and they never conclusively did. Still, the Sodders could not forget the threat, especially after their children disappeared. The fire investigation itself also became controversial. The local authorities concluded that faulty wiring was responsible. A state police inspector reportedly reached the same basic conclusion. The family disagreed. George believed the electrical explanation did not make sense. He remembered that the house had been inspected. He also questioned why lights downstairs appeared to remain on during the fire. According to the family's later recollections, several lights were still burning while the house was on fire. If the fire had been caused by an electrical failure, George wondered whether the electrical system should have behaved differently. But electrical fires can produce complicated effects, and decades later, without the original house or complete evidence from the scene, it is difficult to reconstruct exactly what happened. That uncertainty became one of the central problems of the case. The fire had destroyed the evidence that might have explained it, and the people investigating it in 1945 did not have the technology available today. They could not use modern fire reconstruction techniques. They did not have DNA testing. They could not digitally recreate the scene, and they had no way of knowing which details would become important decades later. The fire department itself faced enormous limitations. The department was largely volunteer. The fire station was only a few miles away, but the firefighters were not immediately dispatched through a modern emergency system. Instead, a chain of telephone calls had to be made to alert the volunteers. By the time firefighters reached the Sodder property, the house had been reduced to ruins. The delay was devastating. If help had arrived sooner, perhaps the outcome would have been different. But nobody could turn the clock back. The firefighters searched the ruins. They expected to find the remains of the 5 children, but they found none. That became perhaps the most powerful argument for the Sodder family's theory. If the children had died in the fire, where were they? The fire chief reportedly suggested that the heat had been intense enough to completely destroy their bodies. But the family did not believe that explanation. They pointed out that objects inside the house had survived. Appliances, metal items, household objects. If those things remained recognizable, why were there no identifiable remains of 5 children? It was a question the family would repeat for years. But there is another side to that argument. The absence of remains does not automatically prove that the children survived. Fire can destroy or fragment human remains, and the exact conditions inside a burning structure can vary dramatically. The important point is that the family wanted more certainty than the investigation could provide. They wanted physical evidence. Instead, they received assumptions. The authorities issued death certificates for the 5 children before the end of the year. Their official cause of death was recorded as fire or suffocation. The case appeared to be finished, but the Sodders did not consider it finished. They began their own investigation, and their investigation eventually brought them to the federal government. In 1947, George and Jenny wrote to the FBI. They explained their concerns. They wanted federal investigators to examine the possibility that their children had been kidnapped. The response came from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The Bureau explained that the matter appeared to be local and therefore outside its investigative jurisdiction. The FBI indicated that agents could assist if local authorities authorized it. That authorization never came. The federal investigation did not happen. For the Sodders, it was another disappointment. But they still had one option: a private investigator. They hired C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley began looking into the circumstances surrounding the fire, and what he reportedly found only increased the family's suspicions. One of the strange details involved the insurance salesman who had allegedly threatened George. Tinsley discovered that the man had connections to the coroner's jury that had concluded the fire was accidental. That was certainly unusual. But again, an unusual connection does not prove a conspiracy. The man could have been connected to the investigation without having anything to do with the fire. Still, the Sodders wondered whether the official investigation had been influenced. Another story concerned the fire chief. According to later accounts, the chief reportedly told someone privately that he had found what appeared to be a human organ in the ashes. The object was supposedly placed in a box and buried. When the Sodders later recovered it, a local funeral director reportedly identified it as beef liver rather than human tissue. The story became another source of suspicion, but it also demonstrates how difficult the case became. Different versions of the story circulated. Some details were remembered differently, and decades later, it was difficult to determine exactly what had happened. The family nevertheless continued searching. They were convinced that the official explanation had failed to answer too many questions. Then came the 1949 excavation. The family wanted to examine the property again. The ruins had already been covered with dirt, partly because George wanted to preserve the location as a memorial. Now investigators returned to the site. They searched the ground more carefully, and eventually they discovered several pieces of bone. For the first time, the family had physical material that might answer the central question. Were these the remains of one of the children? The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution. The results were not what the family expected. The bones were identified as 4 lumbar vertebrae from one person. The estimated age appeared to be older than most of the missing children. The oldest, Maurice, had been 14. The bones appeared more developed than would normally be expected for a 14-year-old, although the report acknowledged that the development could potentially occur in someone around that age. Even more importantly, the bones did not show obvious evidence of having been burned. That made the situation even more confusing. If the bones came from the house fire, why were they not burned? And if they did not come from the fire, where had they come from? The Smithsonian report suggested that the bones might have been present in the dirt George had used to fill the basement after the fire. The report also noted that it was unusual for only 4 vertebrae to be found without additional skeletal remains. The family still did not have the answer. The bones did not prove that the children had survived. They also did not provide a clear identification of any of the children. The uncertainty remained, and that uncertainty became permanent. The authorities continued treating the children as victims of the fire. The family continued treating them as missing. 2 completely different versions of the same night existed side by side. One said, 5 children died in a house fire. The other said, 5 children disappeared while their home burned. And neither explanation could completely erase the questions surrounding the other. As the years passed, the Sodders became increasingly determined to keep the children's names alive. They placed the billboard near the highway. They offered a reward. They distributed photographs. And they continued investigating reports from across the country. The billboard would remain for decades. The children would grow older only in the imagination of the family. Their photographs remained frozen in 1945. But the world around them continued changing. Newspapers changed. Technology changed. Investigators changed. The family grew older. Yet the mystery remained exactly where it had been. 5 children, 1 fire, no confirmed remains, and no confirmed explanation. The most haunting possibility was not necessarily that the children had survived. It was that the family might never know. Because if the children had died, the evidence had disappeared. And if they had survived, their trail had disappeared. Either way, something had been lost. Something that the Sodders could not recover. And perhaps that is why the fire became such an important part of the mystery. The fire was supposed to explain everything. Instead, it created even more questions. What caused it? Why did it spread so quickly? Why was the telephone unavailable? Why was the ladder missing? Why did the trucks fail? Why were the children's remains not conclusively recovered? And most importantly, were the children actually inside the house when it burned? That question would follow the family for the rest of their lives. And the answer, if it existed, might be hidden in one of the final moments before the fire. Because before the flames appeared, something unusual had already happened outside the Sodder home. And someone may have been watching. The strange details did not begin when the house caught fire. According to the family's later recollections, some of them had appeared weeks and even months earlier. At the time, none of those moments seemed important enough to remember. But after 5 children disappeared, George and Jenny began looking backward. They started asking themselves a frightening question. Had someone been watching their family before the fire? One incident stood out. A stranger had reportedly appeared at the Sodder home several months before Christmas. He asked George about hauling work. At first, the conversation seemed ordinary. George operated trucks and had experience with hauling, so people sometimes approached him about work. But the man's behavior soon became unusual. Instead of simply discussing employment, he reportedly walked around the property. He looked toward the electrical system, and according to the family's later account, he pointed toward the fuse boxes. Then he made a strange prediction. He told George that the electrical system would eventually cause a fire. At the time, George did not consider the statement a serious threat. Why would he? The electrical system had reportedly been inspected by the local power company. The family believed it was in good condition. So the stranger left, and life continued. But after the fire, the memory became much more disturbing. Because suddenly, the stranger's words sounded less like an observation and more like a warning. Or perhaps even a threat. There was another incident. A man had approached George about life insurance. George was not interested. The conversation reportedly became heated. And according to the family's account, the man became angry enough to make a disturbing statement about the Sodder home and the children. He reportedly warned George that the house would burn and the children would be destroyed. He also connected the threat to George's outspoken criticism of Benito Mussolini. George had never hidden his dislike of the Italian dictator. He sometimes argued with people in the local Italian-American community about politics, but he had not believed that those arguments could put his family in danger. After the fire, however, everything looked different. The family began wondering whether George had made enemies. Could someone have wanted revenge? Could someone have threatened the family and then followed through? Or were these simply coincidences that became frightening only after the tragedy? There was no definitive answer, and that distinction is important. The threats were part of the family's later theory. They were not proof that the people involved caused the fire, but the memories continued to trouble George. There was also another strange observation. Some members of the family reportedly remembered seeing a man sitting in a car near the area where the children traveled home from school. He appeared to be watching them. Again, at the time, nobody knew what it meant. A man sitting in a parked car could have been waiting for someone. He could have been passing through. He could have had nothing to do with the Sodder family. But after the children disappeared, the memory became much harder to ignore. The family began connecting these incidents. A stranger had examined the electrical system. Another man had made a threat. Someone had appeared to watch the children. And then on Christmas Eve, a fire destroyed the house. 5 children disappeared. The family wondered whether these events were connected. But investigators had to confront the same problem they had faced from the beginning. There was no direct evidence tying those people to the crime. There were memories. There were statements. There were suspicions. But there was no confirmed identification of the person who caused the fire. Then came the events of Christmas Eve. The Sodder family had been preparing for Christmas. Some of the children had been downstairs. Others were upstairs. The family had presents. The house was decorated. It was supposed to be an ordinary holiday night. Around midnight, the telephone rang. Jenny answered. The caller asked for a person the family did not recognize. Jenny explained that the caller had reached the wrong number, but she remembered hearing laughter and the sound of glasses in the background. It was strange, but not necessarily dangerous. Wrong numbers happened. The caller could have simply dialed incorrectly. Jenny returned to the family. She noticed that several lights downstairs were still on. The curtains were open, and the front door was unlocked. She closed the curtains. She turned off the lights. She locked the door, and then she went back upstairs. The house became quiet for a short time. Then Jenny heard a sharp sound. A loud bang came from above. She heard something roll across the roof. She did not know what it was. She could not see anything outside, and there was no obvious reason to believe that the sound had anything to do with the fire. But that memory would become important later. Roughly half an hour afterward, Jenny woke again. This time she smelled smoke. The fire had begun. The family woke in confusion. George tried to understand what was happening. Smoke filled the house. The flames spread rapidly. George and several children escaped. But 5 children were still upstairs. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. George tried to reach them. He broke a window while attempting to get back inside. The broken glass badly injured his arm, but he could not reach the children. The smoke was too heavy. The fire had taken over the lower part of the house. The staircase was effectively blocked. George ran outside. He looked for the ladder. It was gone. It was gone. The ladder had normally been kept against the house. Now it could not be found. George searched for another way. He thought of his trucks. If he could move one close enough to the house, perhaps he could climb onto it. But neither truck would start. The family later remembered this as one of the most suspicious details of the entire night. Both vehicles had reportedly worked before. Now both failed. George had very little time. He tried another idea. He attempted to use water from a rain barrel, but the water had frozen. Everything he tried seemed to fail. And upstairs, 5 children remained trapped. Marion, one of the older children who had escaped, ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. But the telephone system did not immediately connect the call. Another neighbor also tried to call. Again, there was no immediate response. Eventually, a neighbor drove into town and found the fire chief. The fire department used a telephone chain to contact the volunteers. The fire station was only a few miles away, but the firefighters did not arrive until much later. By then, the house was almost completely destroyed. The delay became another point of frustration for the family. Had the children been trapped because of the fire alone? Or had the circumstances surrounding the fire made rescue deliberately difficult? The family believed the second possibility, but there was still no proof. When the fire was finally under control, the family expected the worst. They believed the 5 children had died. They searched the ruins, but there were no obvious human remains. No bodies, no recognizable bones, nothing that could give the family certainty. Authorities eventually concluded that the children had died in the fire. But George and Jenny could not accept it. They began examining every detail of the night. The telephone, the ladder, the trucks, the strange noise, the lights, the open curtains, the unlocked door, and the possibility that someone had been watching the house. Then another detail emerged. A witness reportedly saw a man at the scene after the fire. The man was apparently carrying away a block and tackle device used for lifting engines from vehicles. That object was important because it could potentially have been used with the Sodder trucks. The man was eventually identified and reportedly pleaded guilty to stealing the equipment, but he denied having anything to do with the fire. So once again, the family had a strange coincidence, but not a proven connection. The case was filled with these moments. A suspicious detail would appear. It would seem to fit the family's theory. Then another explanation would emerge. The truth remained somewhere between the possibilities, and that uncertainty became the defining feature of the investigation. The family believed someone had deliberately caused the fire. Authorities believed it had been accidental. The family believed the children had been kidnapped. Authorities believed they had died. 2 completely different versions of the same event, and neither could be fully proven. Years later, the family continued experimenting with the question of whether the fire could have destroyed the children's remains. Jenny reportedly burned animal bones to see what remained. She found that bones did not simply disappear. They became charred fragments. She also spoke with someone connected to a crematorium, who explained that even very intense cremation can leave bone material behind. For Jenny, this reinforced her belief that the absence of remains was suspicious. But the conditions of a house fire are not identical to those inside a controlled cremation chamber. The temperature, oxygen supply, fuel, duration, and movement of the fire can all vary. That means the family's experiment could not prove what happened inside the house. Still, it showed how desperately Jenny wanted an answer. She was not willing to accept an explanation simply because authorities had given it to her. She wanted to understand, and she wanted evidence. The same determination shaped the family's later search of the property. In 1949, several years after the fire, they returned to the site with pathologist Oscar B. Hunter. They excavated the area. They found small objects, coins, a partially burned dictionary, and 4 pieces of vertebrae. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian. The result was confusing. The bones belonged to one person. Their development suggested an age older than most of the missing children. They did not show evidence of being burned. and only 4 vertebrae were recovered. The Smithsonian concluded that the bones were probably not the remains of the Sodder children. Instead, they may have been present in the dirt George had used to fill the basement after the fire. For the family, that was devastating. The excavation had been their opportunity to finally discover the truth. Instead, it gave them another unanswered question. If the bones were not from the children, where were the children? The family's belief in kidnapping became stronger. They began imagining possible scenarios. Perhaps someone had entered the house before the fire. Perhaps the children had been taken while everyone else was distracted. Perhaps they had been told to leave because the house was burning. Perhaps the person who took them knew the family. And perhaps the children had been transported away before the building collapsed. But those were theories. There was no confirmed evidence showing that any of them had happened. The lack of evidence made the case difficult, and the longer the family searched, the more desperate the situation became. They contacted the FBI. They hired investigators. They offered rewards. They placed photographs on billboards. They followed sightings. And they continued asking questions. One of the most memorable pieces of evidence would arrive years later. But before that photograph appeared, the family had already received many strange reports. Some people claimed to have seen the children. Others claimed to know where they were. Some reports placed them in distant states. Others claimed they had been taken by strangers. Most could not be verified, but every report forced the family to make a difficult decision. Should they believe it, or should they dismiss it? If they dismissed a genuine lead, they might lose the chance to find their children. If they believed every false report, they could spend the rest of their lives chasing ghosts. So they investigated. One lead took George to New York. He had seen a newspaper photograph of school children. One of them looked like Betty. He traveled to Manhattan, but the family of the child would not speak with him. The lead ended. Another report claimed Martha was living in a convent. George investigated. Again, nothing. Another person in Texas claimed to know something about the fire. Another lead took the family toward Florida. Again, nothing. The mystery kept moving. But the children did not. Their photographs remained frozen in time. Maurice was still 14. Martha was still 12. Louis was still 9. Jenny was still 8. Betty was still 5. The world moved forward. The children did not. And that may have been one of the most painful aspects of the case. If they were alive, they were growing older somewhere. They were becoming teenagers. Then adults. Perhaps they were building lives without knowing their true identity. Perhaps they remembered their family. Perhaps they did not. And if they were dead, the family was spending years searching for people who were no longer alive. Either possibility was heartbreaking, but the Sodders never stopped hoping. The billboard along Route 16 became their way of keeping that hope visible. Thousands of people passed it. The photographs were seen by travelers. The names became familiar, and the question remained, what was their fate? The billboard eventually became one of the most enduring symbols of the case. But the family was not only searching for sightings. They were also searching for someone who might explain the fire. Someone who might know why the telephone had failed, why the ladder had disappeared, why the trucks had not started, and why the children had never been found. Perhaps the person responsible had been watching the house before the fire. Perhaps the threats had been meaningful. Or perhaps all of those details were coincidences. That was the problem. The evidence could support more than one story. And without a definitive piece of evidence, investigators could not choose one story with certainty. The family, however, had made their choice. They believed the children had been taken. They believed the fire was deliberate. And they believed someone knew the truth. That belief would survive George's death. It would survive Jenny's death. And it would survive into the next generation. But before the family could ever consider letting go, another extraordinary clue would arrive. An envelope from Kentucky. Inside would be a photograph. A young man, older now, a face that looked remarkably familiar, and a handwritten message that appeared to identify him. The name on the back would be Louis Sodder. If that photograph was genuine, the entire case would change, because it would mean that at least one of the children had survived the fire. But if it was a hoax, then someone had deliberately reopened a wound that had never healed. The family would spend years wondering which possibility was true, and that photograph would become one of the most haunting pieces of the Sodder mystery. For more than 20 years, the Sodder family had lived with uncertainty. They had searched across states. They had followed reported sightings. They had contacted investigators. They had placed photographs of the children on a billboard. And still they had no answer. Then, in the late 1960s, something arrived in the mail that would become one of the strangest clues in the entire case. It was an envelope addressed to Jenny Sodder. There was no return address. The postmark showed Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph. A young man was looking toward the camera. He appeared to be in his 20s. For most people, it might have been nothing more than an anonymous photograph. But for Jenny, the face immediately caught her attention. The young man had dark hair, dark eyes, a strong, straight nose, and an upward tilt to his left eyebrow. According to the family's account, those features reminded them strongly of their son Louis. Louis had been only 9 years old when the Sodder house burned. If he had survived, he would now have been an adult. The photograph therefore created a possibility that the family had spent decades hoping for. Could this be Louis? There was something else. Written on the back of the photograph was a short, mysterious message. It appeared to say, "Louis Sodder, then, I love brother Frankie." Additional letters and numbers followed. The meaning of those final characters was never established, and there was no known brother named Frankie in the Sodder family. That made the message even stranger. Who was Frankie? Why had the writer identified the man as Louis? And why had the photograph been sent to Jenny? The family immediately took the possibility seriously. They compared the photograph with pictures of Louis as a child. They studied his facial features. They looked at the shape of his face. They looked at his eyes. They looked at his nose. And they believed the resemblance was too strong to dismiss. But resemblance is not identification. There was no birth certificate attached to the photograph. No official record. No DNA test. No witness who could confirm that the young man was Louis. The photograph was simply a photograph. And yet, to the Sodders, it represented something enormous. Hope. For years, they had been told their children were dead. Now they had a photograph of a man who appeared to resemble one of them. They could not simply ignore it. So they did what they had done before. They hired a private investigator. The investigator was sent to Kentucky. His job was simple. Find out who had sent the photograph. Find out who the man in the photograph was. And determine whether he could possibly be Louis Sodder. But then something happened that made the story even stranger. The investigator never came back with an answer. The Sodders never heard from him again. They could not locate him. They did not receive the information they had expected. And the Kentucky lead simply disappeared. That left the family with the photograph, but no explanation. Was the photograph genuine? Was someone trying to tell them that Louis had survived? Or was someone playing a cruel joke on grieving parents? The family had no way of knowing, but they were not willing to throw the photograph away. Instead, they decided to make it public. The photograph was added to the family's famous billboard. The billboard had originally shown the 5 missing children as they looked in 1945. Now there was another image, a photograph of an older man. The family believed he might be Louis. It was a remarkable decision, because if the photograph was genuine, someone might recognize him. And if it was false, the public might help expose the deception. But the family was careful. They did not publicly reveal every detail connected with the Kentucky postmark. They feared that if Louis really was alive, releasing too much information might somehow put him in danger. So the photograph remained a clue rather than a full explanation. And the mystery continued. By this point, the Sodder children had been missing for more than 20 years. The younger children would have become adults. The older children would have been middle-aged. The family members who had been children themselves on the night of the fire were now adults. And yet the 5 missing siblings remained frozen in the past. Their photographs showed them as children. Their names remained on the billboard. And the family continued asking what had happened. The photograph from Kentucky changed the emotional landscape of the case. Before it arrived, the family had only the possibility that the children might have survived. Now they had something that looked like evidence, but there was an important difference. It was evidence of possibility, not proof. No one had established that the man was Louis, and that distinction would remain important for decades. Still, the photograph became one of the strongest reasons for the family's continued belief that at least one child had survived. It also created a new question. If Louis had survived, What happened to the other 4? Had they also been taken? Had they been separated? Had some survived while others died? Or was the photograph unrelated to the case? There was no answer. The family began wondering whether the missing children might have been deliberately given new identities. Perhaps someone had taken them far away. Perhaps they had been raised by other people. Perhaps they had been told that their biological family was dead. And perhaps they had grown up without ever knowing the truth. But again, those were possibilities. There was no confirmed evidence that this had happened. The photograph simply kept the theory alive. And as the years passed, the family became increasingly aware of another painful reality. Time was running out. George and Jenny were getting older. They had spent decades searching. They wanted to know the truth before they died. Not necessarily because they needed their children to be alive. They wanted certainty. If the children had died in the fire, they wanted convincing evidence. If they had survived, they wanted to know where they were. That was the position George eventually expressed publicly. He did not simply want a particular answer. He wanted the truth. That distinction is important, because the Sodder family's story is often remembered as a family that refused to believe their children were dead. But their deeper concern was uncertainty. They had never been given enough evidence to settle the question, and so they continued searching. The billboard remained. The photographs remained. The reward remained. And the family continued receiving occasional reports. Some people claimed to have seen the children. Others claimed to know someone who had information. But none of those leads produced a confirmed identification. The Kentucky photograph was different because it could actually be examined. But even after all those years, no definitive forensic testing could prove that the man was Lewis. Modern DNA technology did not exist when the photograph arrived, and there was no confirmed biological sample from Lewis that could be compared with the adult man. The photograph therefore remained exactly what it had been when it arrived. A mystery, a face, a name written on the back, and a question. Who was he? There was another strange detail. The message referred to a brother named Frankie. The Sodders did have a son named Frank, but the exact wording of the message was unclear. It could have been referring to him, or it could have meant something else. The final characters on the photograph were also mysterious. Some interpretations read them as numbers, others as letters. No confirmed explanation has ever established what they meant. This uncertainty became another layer of the case. The photograph looked deliberate. Someone had written on the back. Someone had addressed the envelope to Jenny. Someone had mailed it from Kentucky. But who? And why? If it was a hoax, the person responsible had gone to considerable effort. If it was genuine, the sender had somehow known that the Sodders were still searching. Either possibility was unsettling. The family chose to believe it was genuine. They placed an enlarged version of the photograph inside their home. It became something they could look at every day, a possible image of the son they had lost. For Jenny especially, the photograph represented hope. She could look at the face and imagine that Lewis had grown up, that somewhere he was alive, that somewhere he might still remember his family. But hope could also be painful, because there was still no contact, no telephone call, no letter from Lewis himself, no confirmed location, no reunion, only the photograph. That raised another question. If Lewis really was alive, why had he never contacted his parents? The family developed theories. Perhaps he had been threatened. Perhaps he had been told that contacting his family would put them in danger. Perhaps he had been given another identity. Perhaps he did not know who he really was. Or perhaps he simply was not Lewis. The last possibility was the simplest, but it was also the one the family least wanted to believe. They had spent decades hoping, and the photograph gave that hope a face. Yet investigators had to remain objective. A photograph can be misleading. Two unrelated people can resemble one another. And when a family desperately wants to find a missing child, resemblance can appear stronger than it really is. That does not mean the Sodders were imagining things. It means that emotion can influence interpretation. The photograph therefore remained an intriguing lead, but not a confirmed identification. And there was another problem. The private investigator who had been sent to Kentucky had never returned with an answer. If he had found something important, the family never learned what it was. If he had discovered that the photograph was false, they never received that confirmation. His disappearance from the investigation left another unanswered question. What happened during his search? Did he simply abandon the investigation? Did he run into problems? Did he discover something he did not want to report? Or was there a completely ordinary explanation? There is no established answer. And because the case had already become so mysterious, the disappearance of the investigator only added to the story. The family, however, did not stop. George continued to speak about the case. He continued to insist that the children might have survived. He continued to ask for information, and he continued to hope that someone would finally explain what happened. But in 1969, George Sodder died. He had spent almost 24 years searching for his children. He never received the answer he wanted. Jenny continued after his death. She kept the billboard, she kept the photograph, and she kept the memory of the missing children alive. The mystery had now passed from one generation to another. The children who had disappeared were no longer simply missing children. They had become a permanent part of the family's history, and the photograph from Kentucky remained one of the most important pieces of that history. Years later, people would still debate it. Some would say the resemblance was remarkable. Others would say it proved nothing. Some would believe it was evidence that Lewis survived. Others would consider it a cruel hoax. Without an independent identification, the truth could not be established. And that is where the case becomes especially haunting. A photograph can show you a face, but it cannot tell you a person's name. The name has to come from somewhere else. A record, a witness, a biological match, a personal history, something that connects the face to the identity. The Sodders never received that connection, and so the photograph remained suspended between hope and uncertainty. There was another reason the family continued believing the children had survived. The physical evidence from the fire had never conclusively established their deaths. The later excavation had produced only a small number of bones. Those bones were not conclusively identified as belonging to the children, and the Smithsonian examination raised further questions about their origin that left the family with two unresolved pieces: no confirmed remains, and a photograph that might show one of the children alive decades later. Neither was enough to prove survival, but together they made it difficult for the family to accept the official conclusion, and that was why the Sodder billboard remained. The 5 children's faces stayed visible to anyone traveling through the area. The photographs represented a question that had never been answered. Not who committed the crime, but something even more basic. What happened to them? The billboard became a kind of public memorial, a reminder that the family had never accepted the disappearance as a closed story, and it remained there for decades. By the time Jenny died in 1989, the original fire was already more than 40 years in the past. The children would have been elderly if they had survived. The possibility of finding them alive was becoming increasingly unlikely, but the family still wanted answers. The billboard was eventually removed after Jenny's death, yet the mystery did not disappear with it. The story continued to be discussed. The photograph continued to circulate, and new generations became interested in the strange case of the 5 children who vanished on Christmas Eve. Today, the photograph is still one of the most debated pieces of evidence. There is no confirmed proof that the man pictured was Lewis Sodder. There is also no definitive proof that the 5 children died in the fire. That is why the case remains unresolved. And perhaps the most important lesson is that the two possibilities should not be confused. Possible survival is not proof of survival, and the absence of remains is not automatic proof of kidnapping. The evidence has to be considered carefully. That is especially important in a case that has been discussed for so many decades. Rumors become mixed with facts. Memories become mixed with later theories. And eventually, it can become difficult to tell where the original evidence ends and the speculation begins. The Sodder family, however, never stopped believing that something had gone wrong. They believed the fire was not simply an accident. They believed their children had not simply vanished into the flames. And they believed someone knew the truth. The photograph from Kentucky became their strongest symbol of that belief. A young man, a familiar face, a mysterious message, and no explanation. The question remained, was this really Lewis Sodder? If it was, then the story of the 5 missing children had to be rewritten. If it was not, then someone had given a grieving family false hope. And both possibilities were disturbing. But there was still another part of the case that needed to be examined. The family had always believed the fire itself was suspicious. And if the fire had been deliberately set, then the missing children might have been taken before the flames destroyed the house. That meant investigators needed to look at the fire from another angle. Not as the end of the story, but as the beginning. Because somewhere between the moment the children went to bed and the moment the house disappeared into flames, something happened. And whatever that something was, it may have determined the fate of 5 children. The photograph from Kentucky had given the Sodder family another reason to believe that at least one of their children might have survived. But there was still a problem. Before anyone could determine what happened to the children, they had to understand what happened inside the house that night. And that meant returning to the beginning. Christmas Eve, 1945. The Sodder family had been preparing for Christmas like countless other families across America. There were presents. There were children moving around the house. There were plans for Christmas morning. Nothing suggested that the night would become the beginning of a mystery that would last for generations. Yet several details from those final hours would later become extremely important. The telephone call, the strange sound on the roof, the fire, the missing ladder, the trucks that would not start, and the absence of the children's remains. Taken individually, each detail could potentially have an explanation. Taken together, they created a story that George and Jenny could not accept. The first question was the telephone. A call came into the Sodder home shortly after midnight. Jenny answered. The caller asked for someone the family did not recognize. Jenny told the person they had the wrong number, but she remembered hearing laughter and the sound of glasses in the background. It was an unusual call, yet at that moment, it did not appear dangerous. Jenny went back to bed. She noticed that some lights were still on. The curtains were open, and the front door was unlocked. She closed the curtains. She turned off the lights. She locked the door. Then she returned upstairs. The house became quiet, until Jenny heard the sound. A loud impact. Something appeared to strike the roof. Then came a rolling noise. She did not know what had caused it. There was no obvious explanation, but roughly half an hour later, she woke again. This time, smoke was inside the house. The fire had started. The family woke in panic. George tried to reach the children upstairs, but the staircase had become inaccessible. The flames were spreading. Smoke filled the rooms. George escaped and began looking for another way to reach his children. He found that the ladder was missing. He tried the trucks. Neither would start. He tried to reach the children through windows, but the fire was too intense. There was almost nothing he could do. One of the older children ran to a neighbor for help. The emergency call was eventually made, but the volunteer fire department did not arrive immediately. By the time firefighters reached the house, it was already heavily involved in flames. The structure could not be saved, and 5 children were missing. The official assumption was immediate. The children had been trapped upstairs. They had died, but then came the question that would change the case. Where were their remains? The fire had destroyed almost everything, but investigators expected some evidence. Instead, almost nothing was found. The absence became one of the central mysteries. The family could not understand it. George had seen what remained of the house. There were objects that had survived. There were pieces of metal. There were household items. There were fragments of furniture. But the 5 children were simply gone. This was not enough to prove that they had survived, but it was enough to make the family question the conclusion. Then another detail became important. The children's rooms. If they had been asleep upstairs, investigators would expect evidence that they had been trapped there. But the destruction made reconstruction difficult. The house had collapsed. The fire had consumed much of the interior, and the original investigation did not have modern forensic methods. Everything had to be interpreted from the ruins. This meant that some questions could never be answered with certainty. But George and Jenny did not want uncertainty. They wanted proof. If their children were dead, they wanted to know. If their children were alive, they wanted to find them. That was the reason they continued investigating. And one of the strongest theories began to take shape. Perhaps the children had been removed from the house before the fire. If someone had kidnapped them, the fire could have been intended to hide the evidence. The family began wondering whether the fire was a cover-up. That theory could potentially explain several suspicious details. Someone might have cut the telephone line. Someone might have moved the ladder. Someone might have disabled the trucks. and someone might have started the fire. But there was still one enormous question. How could 5 children be removed from the house without the rest of the family noticing? It was Christmas Eve. The house was occupied. The children were not all young. Maurice was 14. Martha was 12. Louis was 9. Jenny was 8. Betty was 5. If someone had entered the house and tried to take them, there was a risk of being discovered. Unless the person knew the family. Unless the children were persuaded to leave. Unless they were taken while the fire was already causing confusion. Or unless the entire theory was wrong. Investigators had to consider all of those possibilities. The family, however, believed the children had been taken. And they had another reason. The reports of sightings. If even one of those sightings was genuine, the children might have survived. The tourist court report was especially interesting. A woman claimed she had seen the children the morning after the fire. She remembered a group of children at the location. A vehicle with Florida plates was reportedly present. The family believed the children could have been transported south. But the report could not be confirmed. Then came the Charleston sighting. A woman claimed she had seen 4 of the children about a week after the fire. The children were reportedly with adults who appeared to be Italian. They were staying at a hotel. The woman said the adults prevented her from speaking with them. Again, the family saw hope. But again, there was no proof. This was the pattern that followed the family for years. A clue would appear. The family would investigate. And the clue would fail to produce a definitive answer. Yet the family could never completely dismiss the possibility that one of the reports was genuine. Because if even one child had survived, everything changed. And the photograph from Kentucky made that possibility even stronger. The young man in the photograph looked enough like Louis to make the family wonder. If Louis had survived, perhaps the other children had survived too. Perhaps they had been separated. Perhaps they had been raised under different names. Perhaps someone had intentionally kept them away from their parents. But why? That was where the theories became increasingly complicated. Some people believed the children could have been kidnapped for money. But the Sodder family was not wealthy enough to make that explanation obvious. Others believed George's political views might have created enemies. Some theories suggested organized crime. Others suggested personal revenge. But none of those theories had been conclusively established. There was another possibility. Perhaps the children had not been kidnapped at all. Perhaps they had somehow escaped the house during the fire. Perhaps they became separated from the family. Perhaps they were taken somewhere for safety. But 5 children disappearing together without leaving a reliable trail would still be extremely difficult to explain. The simplest explanation remained the official one. They died in the fire. And perhaps the fire was simply severe enough to destroy the evidence. But the family could not accept that. The disagreement became permanent. The authorities had one story. The Sodders had another. And neither side could produce enough evidence to completely end the argument. Years later, the family's search continued. They placed the billboard. They offered a reward. They investigated sightings. They followed letters. They hired investigators. And they kept the photographs. The family also kept returning to the strange events surrounding the fire. The missing ladder. The trucks. The telephone. The roof. The threats. Every detail was examined again. But the problem was that the evidence was old. Memories changed. People died. Records disappeared. And the physical scene was long gone. The Sodder property no longer looked like it had in 1945. The burned house had disappeared. The original scene could not be recreated. That meant investigators were forced to rely on what remained. Documents, photographs, statements, and the memories of survivors. The surviving family members were young at the time. That mattered. Children who experience a traumatic event may remember certain details clearly while forgetting others. And when those memories are revisited decades later, they can change. This does not necessarily mean someone is lying. It means memory is complicated. Investigators therefore had to be careful. A detail remembered years later could be valuable, but it could also have been influenced by later stories. That was especially important because the Sodder case became famous. The family heard theories. Newspapers published stories. People discussed the possibility of kidnapping. And over time, those ideas could influence how people remembered the original night. Still, there were some details that remained central. The fire. the missing ladder, the failed trucks, the telephone, the missing remains. Those were the foundation of the family's suspicion. Then came another strange question. Why did the family believe the fire had been deliberately started? Because of the combination of circumstances. They believed the electrical explanation was weak. They believed the threats were meaningful. They believed the telephone line had been cut. And they believed the ladder and trucks had been deliberately made unavailable. But there was no definitive forensic evidence proving arson. That is important. The family's belief is part of the history. It is not the same as an established fact. The cause of the fire remains debated in discussions of the case. And because the house was destroyed so long ago, modern investigators cannot simply return to the scene and perform a new fire analysis. The evidence is gone. That is one of the greatest tragedies of the case. The one place that could have answered the questions was destroyed on the same night the mystery began. And once it was gone, investigators were left reconstructing the event from fragments. The fire therefore became both the crime scene and the destruction of the crime scene. That made everything more difficult. If the children had been killed inside, the fire could have destroyed evidence. If the children had been removed before the fire could have destroyed evidence of that too. Either way, the fire protected the truth. And that may be why the mystery survived. The next question was what happened after the flames disappeared. If the children had survived, someone had to transport them. If they had died, someone had to explain the absence of remains. And if the fire had been deliberate, someone had to know how it began. Those questions were still unanswered. The family continued searching for the people who might know. But there was another possibility they could not ignore. What if the person responsible was never connected to the case? What if investigators had focused on the wrong people? What if the threats had been unrelated? What if the photograph was a hoax? What if the children really did die in the fire? The family had to live with those possibilities too. And that is what made their search so painful. They wanted to believe their children were alive. But they also knew they could not prove it. The photograph from Kentucky became their strongest emotional clue. The bones became their strongest physical question. The fire became the central mystery. And the sightings became the reason they continued looking. For years, the Sodders lived between those possibilities. They could not bury their children because they did not know where their bodies were. But they could not bring them home because they did not know where they were. They were trapped in the middle. That is what makes missing person cases so difficult. There is no clear ending, no final goodbye, only uncertainty. And the Sodder family lived with that uncertainty for the rest of their lives. Eventually George died, then Jenny. But the story continued through their children and grandchildren. The billboard eventually came down. The photographs were preserved, and the mystery continued to be discussed. Over the decades, new people examined the evidence. Some believed the kidnapping theory. Others believed the fire theory. Some thought the children might have survived. Others believed the lack of remains could be explained by the fire. But no theory could conclusively answer every question. And so the case remained open in the public imagination. One of the most important things to remember is that the mystery does not have a confirmed solution. There is no verified proof that the 5 children survived. There is also no definitive physical identification proving that all 5 died in the fire. That uncertainty is what makes the case unusual. And it is why the story has continued for so many years. The Sodder children became more than missing people. They became symbols of unanswered questions. Their photographs remained. Their names remained. And their family's search remained part of the history of Fayetteville. But one question still stood above all the others. If the children were not found in the ruins, where did they go? To answer that, investigators would have to follow the trail beyond West Virginia, toward the reported sightings, toward the strange photograph, toward the people who claimed to have seen the children, and perhaps toward someone who knew more than they ever admitted. Because if the children really survived, the trail had to lead somewhere. And if they did not survive, investigators still had to explain why the evidence disappeared with them. Either way, the trail led away from the burned house. And that was where the next chapter of the mystery would begin. As the years passed, the Sodder family began to understand that finding their children would depend on something very small. A memory, a photograph, a stranger recognizing a face, a person remembering something they had seen years earlier. The family had no confirmed grave to visit, no final report, that could explain everything. Only questions, and those questions led them far beyond Fayetteville. The most important possibility was simple. If the children had survived the fire, somebody must have seen them afterward. That meant every reported sighting had to be examined. One of the earliest reports came from the morning after the fire. A woman who operated a tourist stop reportedly told authorities that she had seen several children there. She remembered children being present with other people. There was also reportedly a car with Florida license plates. The detail immediately caught the Sodders' attention. Florida was hundreds of miles away. If the children had really been taken south, the car could have been part of the explanation. But there was a problem. The woman could not conclusively prove that the children were the Sodder children. There were no photographs, no documents, no confirmed identities, only her memory. And memory, especially after a traumatic event, can be complicated. The family nevertheless followed the lead. They had to, because if there was even a small possibility that the children were alive, they could not simply ignore it. Another report came from Charleston. A woman claimed that she had seen 4 of the missing children about a week after the fire. The children were reportedly staying at a hotel. They were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. The adults appeared to be Italian. The woman said the adults were protective of the children and prevented her from speaking with them. Then the group left. For the Sodders, this was an extraordinary possibility. 4 children, alive, only days after the fire. But once again, there was no definitive proof. The family could not establish that the children were actually Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. The report remained a lead, and the family continued searching. There were other sightings. Some were vague. Some were contradictory. Some involved only 1 child. Others involved several. Some placed the children in West Virginia. Others placed them hundreds of miles away. Every report created a new direction, and every direction eventually seemed to disappear. The family began to understand that searching for 5 children was different from searching for 1. 5 people could be separated. They could be given different identities. They could be taken to different places. Or the reports could simply be mistaken. There was no way to know. The children were also growing older. That made identification increasingly difficult. A photograph of a 5-year-old child could not easily be compared with an adult decades later. Features change. Faces mature. Hair changes. Expressions change. Even family members can sometimes fail to recognize someone they have not seen for many years. That meant every later sighting had to be treated carefully. But for the Sodders, the emotional stakes were enormous. They wanted to believe the children were alive, and every report gave them another reason to hope. Then came one of the strangest developments. George saw a photograph in a newspaper. It showed a group of school children. One of the boys looked enough like Louis that George believed he had to investigate. He traveled to New York City. The trip was not simply a search for information. It was a father's attempt to answer a question that had haunted him for years. Could this boy be his son? George wanted to speak with the child's family, but they refused to cooperate. The lead ended. George returned home without an answer, but he did not stop searching. The family continued distributing photographs. They continued offering rewards, and the famous billboard remained near the highway. The children's faces looked down at passing cars. People who had never met the Sodders learned their names. The billboard became a permanent question. What was their fate? It also served another purpose. It allowed travelers to recognize the children. If someone had seen them after the fire, perhaps one of those photographs would trigger a memory. The family hoped that eventually someone would say, "I know that face." But no confirmed identification came. Years passed. Then another unusual clue appeared. A letter. Someone claimed to know something about the children. The details of these communications varied, and many were never verified. But the family continued to receive reports. Some appeared sincere. Others seemed suspicious. The family had to learn a difficult lesson. Not everyone who contacted them necessarily wanted to help. When a family offers a reward for information about missing children, it can attract people who want money. It can also attract people who simply want attention. And sometimes cruel people deliberately target grieving families. The Sodders therefore had to examine every report. Was it credible? Could the person have known what they claimed? Were there independent witnesses? Was there any evidence? Most of the time, the answer was no. But they still followed the leads, because the alternative was to stop looking, and they were not ready to stop. The family's belief in kidnapping also became stronger because of the strange events surrounding the fire. The missing ladder, the failed trucks, the telephone problem, the reported threats, the suspicious strangers, the absence of remains, and now the sightings. Together, these details seem to form a pattern. But patterns can be misleading. Human beings naturally connect events. If two things happen close together, we often assume they are connected. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are not. The Sodder family believed they were. Investigators were less certain. That disagreement would continue for decades. Another important factor was the lack of modern forensic technology. If the case had happened decades later, investigators could have used DNA testing. They could have examined biological evidence. They could have compared unidentified remains with family members. They could have searched digital records. They could have used surveillance footage. None of those tools existed in 1945. The investigation depended heavily on physical evidence and eyewitness accounts. And much of the physical evidence had already been lost. The house had burned. The scene had been disturbed. The remains had not been clearly recovered. And years later, the property had changed. The case was becoming a historical puzzle. Yet the family kept the evidence they did have. Photographs, letters, newspaper articles, witness accounts, and eventually the Kentucky photograph. The photograph became especially important because it seemed to provide something the family had never had before. A possible image of one of the children as an adult. But again, the photograph could not be verified. There was no confirmed identity, no known location, no reliable witness. The message on the back remained mysterious, and the person who sent it remained unknown. The family wondered whether the sender might have been trying to contact them without revealing their identity. Perhaps someone knew where Lewis was. Perhaps someone had found him. Perhaps Lewis himself had somehow arranged for the photograph to be sent. Or perhaps the entire thing was a hoax. The uncertainty was unbearable, but the family kept the photograph, and they continued searching. Meanwhile, the rest of the country was changing. The Second World War was now a distant memory. New generations were being born. The children who had disappeared on Christmas Eve would have been adults. Their parents were aging. The original investigators were aging. Witnesses were dying. Every year that passed made the possibility of finding a reliable eyewitness smaller, but it also made the case more famous. People began telling the story to their children. Then those children told their own children. The 5 missing Sodder children became part of local history, and eventually, they became part of American true crime history. But the family's original question remained. Was the case mysterious? Everyone agreed it was. The question was, what actually happened? There were several possibilities. The first was the official explanation. The 5 children died in the fire. The lack of remains could be explained by the destruction of the house. The second possibility was that the children survived the fire, but were accidentally separated from the family. Perhaps they left the house before it collapsed. Perhaps they were taken somewhere by strangers. The third possibility was kidnapping. Someone deliberately removed the children and started the fire to conceal the crime. The fourth possibility involved a combination. Perhaps some children escaped. Perhaps some died. Perhaps the family misunderstood what happened in the confusion. There was no evidence strong enough to completely eliminate every possibility. That was the problem, and it remains the problem. The family continued to believe the kidnapping theory. They believed someone knew where the children were. They believed the fire was part of a larger plan, and they believed the investigation had failed to uncover the truth. But even the family recognized that they could not prove every part of their theory. Their search was driven by hope. Hope that the children had survived. Hope that someone would remember. Hope that the truth would eventually appear. One of the most difficult aspects of the case was the possibility that the children could have been separated. Imagine 5 siblings disappearing. If they were kidnapped together, why were there no confirmed sightings afterward? If they were separated, how would the kidnappers control them? And if they were raised under different identities, how would they ever discover the truth? These questions made the theory complicated, but not impossible. People disappear for many reasons. Families can be separated. Children can be moved across state lines, and identities can become difficult to trace, especially in an era when records were mostly paper-based. Still, extraordinary claims require strong evidence, and the Sodder case never produced enough evidence to establish that the children had been kidnapped. That is why historians and investigators remain cautious. The sightings are interesting. The photograph is interesting. The fire is suspicious in some respects. But none of these details alone solves the case. The family, however, did not need a courtroom standard to continue hoping. They only needed uncertainty. As long as there was no confirmed proof of death, they could continue believing their children might be alive. That belief lasted for decades. George died in 1969. Jenny died in 1989. But the family's search continued through their surviving children. The billboard eventually came down. The photographs were preserved, and the mystery remained. One of the most painful things about the story is that the 5 children never got the chance to grow up in public memory. Their lives stopped in 1945. Maurice remained 14. Martha remained 12. Louis remained 9. Jenny remained 8. Betty remained 5. Their family members grew older. But the missing children remained forever young in the photographs. That is what made every later sighting so emotionally powerful. Whenever someone claimed to have seen one of them, the family could imagine the person they might have become. A teenager, a young adult, a parent, perhaps even a grandparent. The possibilities were endless. But so were the unanswered questions. If they survived, did they remember their family? Did they know their parents were searching? Did they ever see the billboard? Did they ever see their own childhood photographs? Did they ever wonder where they came from? Or was the entire idea simply a false hope created by the absence of remains? Nobody knows, and that is why the Sodder mystery has survived. There is no single piece of evidence that closes the door. There is only a collection of clues that point in different directions. The fire points one way. The missing remains point another. The sightings suggest another possibility. The photograph creates another, and the family's own suspicions create another. The truth could be somewhere inside those possibilities, or it could be something nobody has considered. That is what makes old cold cases so difficult. The answer may not be the most popular theory. It may be hidden in an overlooked detail, a forgotten document, a witness statement, a photograph, or a name. And that possibility is why the case has never completely disappeared. Even today, people still ask about the Sodder children. They still examine the photographs. They still debate the fire. They still wonder about the billboard. And they still ask whether the children could have survived. But perhaps the most important clue remains the simplest. 5 children were expected to be inside the house. The house burned. The children disappeared. And no confirmed remains were recovered. That is the foundation of the mystery. Everything else comes afterward. And once the family began following the sightings, the story became even stranger. Because some reports placed the children far from West Virginia. Some suggested they had been seen traveling with adults, and one mysterious photograph appeared to show an adult who looked like Louis. The clues seemed to be pointing away from the burned house. But there was still another possibility. Perhaps the children had never left the area at all. Perhaps the answer was closer than anyone realized. And perhaps the key was hidden in the people who were around the Sodder family before the fire. The next chapter will return to those people. The strangers, the threats, the arguments, and the possibility that someone had a reason to target the family. Because if the fire was deliberate, the most important question may not be, where did the children go? It may be, who wanted them gone? If the fire was deliberately started, then the next question was unavoidable. We want to target the Sodder family. George and Jenny had spent years looking back at the people who had crossed paths with them before Christmas Eve. Some had made threats. Some had behaved strangely. And some had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But suspicion was not proof. The first person who attracted attention was the insurance salesman. Before the fire, he had approached George about life insurance. George refused. According to the family's account, the conversation became heated, and the man allegedly made a disturbing statement about the Sodder home eventually burning and the children being destroyed. After the fire, that statement became impossible for the family to forget. But investigators still had to ask an important question. Was it a genuine threat? Or was it simply an angry remark from a salesman who had been rejected? There was no confirmed evidence showing that the man had returned to the Sodder property on Christmas Eve. There was no established proof that he had started the fire, and there was no verified evidence connecting him to the children's disappearance. Still, the family remained suspicious. Then there were George's political disagreements. He was outspoken about Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism. The Sodder family was part of the Italian-American community in Fayetteville, and George's opinions were known. The family later wondered whether his political views had created enemies. Could someone have wanted revenge against him? Could the children have become targets because of their father? It was a frightening possibility. But again, there was no definitive evidence connecting George's political arguments to the disappearance. The theory remained a theory. Another strange incident involved a man who reportedly visited the Sodder home before the fire. He asked about hauling work, but instead of simply discussing the job, he reportedly looked closely at the house and its electrical system. He allegedly warned George that the electrical wiring would eventually cause a fire. At the time, George did not consider the statement especially important. After the fire, however, the memory became disturbing. Why had the stranger been looking at the electrical system? Why had he mentioned a fire? And why had the house actually burned months later? Coincidence was possible, but the Sodders did not believe it was. They wondered whether the man had been examining the property for another reason. Perhaps he had been looking for a way to start a fire. Perhaps he had been gathering information. Or perhaps he really was simply concerned about the wiring. There was no way to know, and this became another recurring problem. The case contained many details that were suspicious when viewed together, but none of them individually proved a crime. That distinction became more important as the years passed. The Sodders wanted to connect the clues. Investigators wanted evidence that could survive scrutiny. The two approaches were not always the same. Then there was the man reportedly seen near the road. A witness claimed that someone had been watching the children. Again, the identity of the person was uncertain. He could have been completely innocent, but the family wondered whether he had been observing their routine. If someone intended to kidnap children, knowing their movements would be useful. But there was no evidence proving that this had happened. The family was left with another possibility. Perhaps all of these strange events had nothing to do with the fire. Perhaps the threats were unrelated. Perhaps the strangers were innocent. Perhaps the fire really was an accident. And perhaps the children really did die inside the house. That possibility was difficult for the family to accept, but it could not simply be dismissed. The official explanation remained the most straightforward one. The house caught fire. The children were trapped. The fire destroyed the remains. And the family, devastated by grief, became convinced that something else had happened. But the Sodders believed there was more. They pointed to the telephone. They pointed to the missing ladder. They pointed to the trucks. And they pointed to the strange noise on the roof. They believed the combination was too much to ignore. One detail especially troubled them. The ladder had not simply disappeared from the house. It was reportedly found some distance away. That suggested to the family that someone had deliberately moved it. But even that detail had another possible explanation. During a chaotic fire, objects can be moved. People can panic. Neighbors can enter the property. Firefighters can disturb the scene. And the ladder might have been moved by someone for reasons unrelated to the crime. The original investigation did not preserve enough information to settle every possibility. That was the tragedy of the case. The evidence needed to answer the questions had largely disappeared, and once it was gone, every theory became harder to prove. The trucks presented the same problem. George remembered that they would not start, but mechanical problems can happen. A battery can fail. An engine can malfunction. A fuel system can stop working. Two vehicles failing at the same time is unusual. But unusual does not automatically mean deliberate. The family believed someone had interfered with them, but there was no definitive forensic evidence proving sabotage. Then there was the telephone. If the line had truly been cut before the fire, that would be significant. But again, the exact circumstances surrounding the line were not preserved well enough to provide a definitive answer decades later. This left the Sodders with a collection of suspicious circumstances. They did not have one perfect piece of evidence. They had many small pieces, and they believed those pieces belonged together. That belief shaped the rest of their lives. They began looking for a person who could connect everything. Someone who knew the family. Someone who had a motive. Someone who knew the house. Someone who could have approached the property without immediately attracting suspicion. And someone who could potentially have taken 5 children. That was a very narrow description, but it also created another problem. There was no confirmed suspect who matched it. Several people were investigated. Several people were discussed, but no one was conclusively tied to the murders or the children's disappearance. That is why the case remained unsolved. There was suspicion. There were theories, but there was no definitive perpetrator. The family nevertheless continued searching. They kept the children's photographs. They kept the billboard. And they followed every new report. Some reports were about the fire. Others were about sightings. And some were about people who claimed to know what had happened. The family learned to be cautious. A person could provide an impressive story and still be wrong. Another could appear sincere and still be mistaken. And some could deliberately lie. The possibility of false information became especially important after the reward was publicized. The Sodders offered money for information that could help locate their children. That meant anyone looking for financial gain could potentially fabricate a story. The family had to determine which reports deserved attention. But even when a lead appeared weak, they often investigated it anyway, because they could not afford to ignore something genuine. That was the emotional trap of the case. Every lead had 2 possibilities. It could be nothing, or it could be everything, and the family could never know which one it was until they investigated. The billboard became their way of keeping the search alive. Drivers saw the children's faces. People talked about them. The story remained in newspapers, and the names Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty remained in the public memory. But as the years passed, another problem appeared. The people who had seen the children before the fire were aging. The people who had investigated the fire were aging. The witnesses were aging. Eventually, many of them would die. Their memories would disappear with them. That made the case increasingly difficult. Every year reduced the number of people who could provide first-hand information. The family knew this. That was why they continued pressing for answers. They wanted statements documented. They wanted photographs preserved. They wanted the story remembered. And they wanted the children remembered as people, not simply as a mystery. Because that was another painful part of the case. The children had lives before Christmas Eve. They had personalities. They had siblings. They had parents. They had favorite things. They had ordinary childhoods. Then, in a single night, they became names on a billboard. The family wanted people to remember that they were more than missing children. They were 5 members of a family, 5 lives that had been interrupted, and 5 people whose fate remained unknown. That is why the Sodder family continued searching even after many people believed the case was hopeless. The word hopeless meant something different to them. As long as the children had never been conclusively identified as dead, there was still uncertainty. And uncertainty meant there was still something to investigate. That belief continued after George died in 1969. Jenny carried on. She continued keeping the children's photographs visible. She continued believing that the story had not been resolved. And she continued hoping that one day someone would come forward. Then, decades after the fire, the mysterious photograph from Kentucky became another part of that hope. A young man, a familiar face, a message written on the back, and no confirmed identity. The photograph could not solve the case, but it created a possibility. Perhaps Louis had survived. And if Louis had survived, perhaps someone else knew where the other children were. The family could not prove it, but they could not forget it either. The photograph remained, and so did the questions. Who had sent it? Why had it been sent? Who was the man? Why had the private investigator disappeared from the story? And what did the strange message on the back actually mean? Every question produced another. That was the nature of the Sodder mystery. It never simply answered a question. It created another. The fire created the question of the missing children. The missing children created the question of kidnapping. The kidnapping theory created the question of motive. The photograph created the question of Louis's identity. And the lack of remains created the question of whether the children had died at all. The story kept expanding, but the central truth remained hidden. And as the years passed, the possibility of finding the children alive became smaller. Not because anyone had proven they were dead, But because time changes everything, people move, memories disappear, records are lost, and eventually, everyone who personally knew the children would be gone. That was the reality the family faced. If an answer existed, it needed to be found before the last witnesses disappeared. But no answer came. The billboard stayed up, the photograph stayed in the family's possession, and the mystery remained. Eventually, the Sodder family would have to face a painful decision. Should they continue searching forever? Or should they accept that the truth might never be known? For George and Jenny, the answer was clear. They would keep searching. But after their deaths, their surviving children and grandchildren had to decide what to do with the mystery they had inherited. Some continued believing the children had survived. Others were more cautious. But everyone knew the same thing. There was no definitive answer, and there was no confirmed suspect. The Sodder children remained missing. The fire remained unexplained in some respects, and the case remained one of America's most enduring mysteries. But there was still one part of the story we have not fully explored: the aftermath. What happened to the Sodder family after the investigation faded? How did the surviving children live with the loss? Why did the billboard remain for so many decades? And why did the family continue believing that someone knew the truth? Those questions take us into the final years of the search. And as we move closer to the end of this story, one thing becomes clear. The mystery was never only about a fire. It was about a family that refused to stop asking a simple question. Where are children? Chapter 12, The Family That Refused to Forget. For the Sodder family, the fire did not end when the flames disappeared. It followed them into every Christmas, into every family gathering, into every photograph, and into every quiet moment when someone wondered what the 5 missing children might have become. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, 5 names that had once belonged to ordinary children. After December 25th, 1945, they became names on a missing person billboard. The family had been told that the children were dead, but without remains that could be conclusively identified, George and Jenny never felt that they had received a final answer. The official investigation had concluded that the fire was accidental. A state police inspector attributed it to faulty wiring. Death certificates were issued for the 5 children before the end of the year, listing their causes of death as fire or suffocation. For the Sodders, however, the investigation was far from over. They believed too many questions remained. The missing ladder, the trucks that would not start, the telephone problem, the strange noise on the roof, the reports of possible sightings, and eventually the mysterious photograph from Kentucky. Every detail gave them another reason to keep searching. But there was something else, something much more personal. The surviving children had to continue living with what happened that night. Imagine waking up one morning and knowing that 5 of your brothers and sisters were simply gone. Not buried, not found, not explained. Gone. The surviving children had escaped the burning house. Some had been downstairs. Others had managed to get outside. But their lives had been permanently divided into 2 parts. Before the fire, and after the fire. For the youngest surviving child, Sylvia, the loss was especially complicated. She had been only 2 years old when the fire happened. She was rescued from the house and survived. But she grew up surrounded by the memory of siblings she would barely have been old enough to remember clearly. The older children remembered more. They remembered their voices, their personalities, their faces, their routines, and they had to watch as their parents spent decades searching for answers. The family's home was gone. The children's belongings were gone. And the normal life they had known before Christmas Eve was gone too. George and Jenny tried to rebuild. But rebuilding did not mean forgetting. The area where the house had stood became part of the family's memory. George eventually covered the basement with dirt. He wanted the site to remain as a memorial to the children. Years later, the family returned to the property and searched it again. The excavation produced a few small objects and several pieces of vertebrae. But the bones did not solve the mystery. The Smithsonian examination concluded that the 4 lumbar vertebrae belonged to one person and appeared to show a skeletal age older than the oldest missing Sodder child, although the report acknowledged that the development was not impossible for a boy around 14 and a half. The bones also showed no evidence of having been exposed to fire. The report considered it more likely that they had come from the dirt used to fill the basement after the fire. For the family, this was another moment when they could have accepted the official explanation. Instead, they asked more questions. If these bones were not from their children, where were the children? If the fire had destroyed them, why was there so little physical evidence? And if the children had survived, how had 5 children disappeared without leaving a confirmed trail? The questions seemed endless. Eventually, the family took their search to the public. They created flyers. They offered a reward. And they erected the famous billboard along Route 16 near Fayetteville. 5 photographs looked down from the sign. 5 children who had disappeared. The message asked, what was their fate? Were they kidnapped? Were they murdered? Or were they still alive? The billboard remained for almost 4 decades. For people passing through the area, the photographs became familiar. Some travelers probably saw the sign without knowing the story. Others stopped to read it. Some may have remembered the faces. And for the family, that was exactly the point. They wanted the children to remain visible. They did not want the world to forget them, because forgetting was one of the things the family feared most. As the years passed, the children would naturally have grown older. Maurice would no longer look 14. Martha would no longer look 12. Louis would no longer look 9. Jenny would no longer look 8. Betty would no longer look 5. If they had survived, they would have become adults. That made the original photographs less useful for identification. The family therefore needed new photographs, new sightings, new information, anything that could tell them what had happened. And then the reports continued. A woman in St. Louis claimed that Martha was living in a convent. Another report came from Texas. Someone in a bar reportedly claimed to have overheard a conversation connected to the fire. Another person in Florida claimed that the children were staying with a distant relative. George followed these leads. Again and again. He traveled. He asked questions. He searched. And again, he returned home without his children. But he did not stop. The reward eventually increased to $10,000. For a family in that era, it was a significant amount. The message was clear. If someone knew where the children were, the family wanted them to come forward. But rewards can bring genuine information. They can also bring false information. The Sodders had no way of knowing which they were receiving. Every report had to be investigated. Every name had to be checked. Every photograph had to be examined. And every disappointment became another reminder that the family still had no answer. The search eventually became part of the family's identity. They were no longer simply the Sodder family. They were the family whose 5 children disappeared on Christmas Eve. That kind of public attention can be difficult. People ask questions. Strangers offer opinions. Some people believe they know what happened. Others create theories. And the family has to live with the fact that something deeply personal has become a mystery discussed by strangers. Yet George and Jenny continued. They did not want attention for its own sake. They wanted their children. Or, at the very least, they wanted the truth. That distinction remained important. The family was not asking the world to believe a particular theory. They were asking people to help answer a question. What happened? Even the possibility that the children had died was something the family could have eventually accepted. But they wanted evidence. They wanted certainty. Without that, they remained trapped between hope and grief. This is one of the cruelest aspects of a disappearance. When someone dies and their body is recovered, there is a finality. There is a funeral. There is a grave. There is a place to return. But when someone disappears, the mind continues asking questions. Maybe they are alive. Maybe they are coming back. Maybe someone knows where they are. Maybe tomorrow will bring an answer. For the Sodders, tomorrow never brought the answer they wanted. Years became decades. The children remained missing. Then came the Kentucky photograph. It arrived late in the 1960s. An envelope. No clear explanation. Inside was a photograph of a young man. The face reminded the family of Louis. The writing on the back appeared to identify him as Louis Sodder. The message included, "I love Brother Frankie." There were also additional characters whose meaning remained unclear. The family could not simply dismiss it. They hired a private investigator and sent him to Kentucky. But they never heard from him again. The photograph therefore became another unresolved clue. The family eventually added the image to the billboard. The original photograph showed Louis as a 9-year-old. The new photograph showed a young adult who might have been Lewis decades later. To the family, it was deeply meaningful. To an investigator, it was still unverified. There was no independent confirmation of the man's identity. No biological evidence. No confirmed location. No reunion. Only the photograph. And yet it gave the family something they had not had in years. A reason to hope. George would never learn whether the photograph was genuine. He died in 1969. He had spent nearly 24 years searching for his children. He died without knowing what had happened to them. Jenny continued. She kept searching. She kept the children's memory alive. And she kept the billboard standing. Her life became increasingly private. She reportedly built a fence around the property and added rooms to the home, creating more separation between herself and the outside world. The grief remained. She continued wearing black as a sign of mourning, and she never received the certainty she had spent decades seeking. The billboard eventually came down after Jenny's death in 1989, but the mystery did not end. The surviving children had grown older. The next generation had been born, and the questions had passed from parents to children. What really happened? Were the 5 siblings killed in the fire? Were they kidnapped? Was the fire deliberate? Was the photograph real? Who sent it? And why did no one ever come forward with the complete truth? Different members of the family developed different theories. Some believed that the children had been kidnapped by someone they knew. One theory suggested that someone could have entered through the unlocked door, told the children about the fire, and convinced them to leave the house for safety. Another theory suggested organized crime. Some family members wondered whether George's political views had created enemies. Others believed the children might have been victims of a larger kidnapping or trafficking scheme. But these remain theories. None was conclusively established. And that is important. A mystery can contain a theory that explains many details. But until there is evidence strong enough to prove it, the theory remains a possibility. That is exactly where the Sodder case remains. There are suspicious details. There are strange reports. There is a mysterious photograph. There are unanswered questions. But there is no definitive explanation. And perhaps that is why the case has remained alive for so long. People naturally want an ending. They want to know who did it. They want to know why. They want to know where the children went. But the Sodder story does not provide that kind of ending. Instead, it leaves us with uncertainty. And sometimes uncertainty is more difficult than a terrible answer. Because a terrible answer can eventually be accepted. Uncertainty keeps asking the same question. What if? What if the children survived? What if the fire was deliberately started? What if someone knew where they were? What if the photograph really was Lewis? What if the children were taken somewhere far away? And perhaps most painfully, what if the family spent decades searching for people who were already gone? Nobody can answer those questions with certainty. The surviving family members continued carrying the mystery. One of them, Sylvia, remained convinced that her siblings had escaped the flames. She lived for decades after the fire. Even late in life, she maintained that belief. She died in 2021 at the age of 79. Her daughter later explained that Sylvia had grown up in a strange position. She was the youngest surviving child. The older surviving siblings had their own memories and lives. Some had been away from home during important parts of the family's history. But Sylvia remained closely connected to the memory of the missing children. For her, the mystery was not simply an old story. It was part of her childhood, part of her identity, and part of the family she never got to grow up with. That is perhaps one of the most important things to remember when listening to this story. The Sodder children were not simply 5 names in a cold case file. They were brothers and sisters. They were children who had parents waiting for them. They had siblings who remembered them. They had lives that existed before the mystery. The unanswered questions came later. And whatever happened that night, the consequences continued for generations. The house disappeared. The fire disappeared. The original investigators disappeared. The witnesses grew old. The parents died. The billboard came down. But the photographs remained. And so did the question. The Sodder family had spent almost half a century trying to answer it. They never did. Perhaps someone somewhere knew the truth. Perhaps that person died without speaking. Perhaps someone remembered a detail, but never understood its importance. Perhaps an old document still exists. Perhaps the photograph from Kentucky has an ordinary explanation. Or perhaps it contains a clue that was never properly followed. There is no way to know, and that is why the story remains unfinished. But there is another question we need to consider. If the children really did survive, why did they never return? Why did none of them contact the family? Why did no confirmed adult version of any of the 5 children ever come forward? That question is one of the strongest arguments against the survival theory. If the children lived for decades, someone would eventually have known. Someone would have recognized them. Someone would have contacted the family. At least, that is what we might expect. But life does not always follow expectations. People can disappear. Families can become separated. Records can be lost. And identities can change. Still, without evidence, the survival theory cannot be treated as established fact. The same caution applies to the kidnapping theory. It is possible, but possibility is not proof. And the same is true of the fire. The official conclusion was accidental. The family believed it was deliberate, but the original scene is long gone. The evidence is limited, and there is no modern forensic reconstruction that can simply settle the argument. So after all these years, the Sodder case remains caught between 2 worlds. One is the official story. The children died in the fire. The other is the family's belief. The children disappeared. Neither has been conclusively proven in a way that satisfies everyone. And perhaps that is the reason the case continues to fascinate people. It is not simply a murder mystery. It is a disappearance mystery, a fire mystery, a family mystery, and a story about what happens when people are forced to live without answers. The family wanted to know where their children were. They wanted to know whether they were alive. They wanted to know whether someone had hurt them, and they wanted to know why. They never got those answers, but they never stopped asking, and that persistence is perhaps the most lasting part of their story. The 5 children disappeared in 1945. The family searched through the 1940s, then the 1950s, then the 1960s, then the 1970s, and into the 1980s. Nearly half a century passed. Still no definitive answer. Still no confirmed remains. Still no confirmed survivor. Still no confirmed perpetrator. Only questions. And somewhere between the fire and the final years of the family's search, the truth became harder and harder to recover. But perhaps the most important clue was not the photograph, not the billboard, not the sightings. It was the fire itself. Because if we can understand exactly what happened in those final minutes, we may be able to understand whether the children could realistically have survived. And that brings us back to the central mystery. The house burned. The firefighters arrived late. The children were missing. And the scene was never preserved in the way a modern investigation would preserve it. The evidence was gone almost as quickly as the house itself. That may be why the case has never been solved. Not because there were no clues, but because there were too many unanswered questions and too little surviving evidence. And after decades, the people who could have answered those questions were gone. The Sodder family could only continue searching, until eventually there was no one left who could continue the original search. The parents were gone. The billboard was gone. The old witnesses were gone. But the mystery remained. 5 children, 1 Christmas Eve, 1 destroyed home, and a question that still has no definitive answer. What happened to the Sodder children? Perhaps one day an old record will surface. Perhaps a forgotten photograph will be identified. Perhaps new forensic technology will reveal something from surviving evidence. Or perhaps the truth disappeared with the people who knew it. Until then, the case remains what it has been for generations. A family tragedy, a historical mystery, and one of America's most enduring unsolved disappearances. By the time the Sodder family entered the final decades of their search, the world around them had changed completely. The Christmas Eve fire of 1945 was becoming a distant memory for most people. But for the Sodder family, it was never distant. Every year brought another Christmas, another reminder, another empty place where 5 children should have been. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. Their photographs remained almost exactly as they had looked on the night they disappeared. But the people who remembered them were growing older. George had already died in 1969. Jenny continued the search for many more years. She refused to simply accept that the mystery had ended. The billboard remained a visible reminder of that decision. For decades, travelers passing through the area could see the photographs of the 5 missing children. The sign was more than an advertisement for information. It was a statement. The family was still searching. They still wanted answers. And they still believed that someone might know something. But by the 1970s and 1980s, the search had become increasingly difficult. The original witnesses were aging. Some had already died. Others could no longer remember details clearly. The people who had investigated the fire in 1945 were mostly gone. The house itself was gone. The original crime scene could not be reconstructed. And many of the questions that had seemed possible to answer in 1945 were now much harder. Still, the family continued. The children of the surviving Sodder siblings also grew up hearing the story. They knew about the fire. They knew about the missing children. They knew about the billboard. And they knew that their grandparents had never accepted the official explanation. For the younger generation, the mystery became part of their family history. But it was not only a story. It was something that had affected their parents and grandparents for decades. They had grown up with the knowledge that 5 relatives had disappeared. They had grown up seeing their photographs. And they had grown up hearing theories about what might have happened. Some believed the children had been kidnapped. Some wondered whether the fire had been deliberately started. Others were more cautious. They understood that the evidence did not provide a definite answer. But everyone shared one thing. They wanted to know what happened. The family continued receiving occasional information. Sometimes it came through letters, sometimes through strangers, sometimes through people claiming to have seen one of the children. Most of these leads went nowhere, but the family could not ignore them, because if they ignored a genuine lead, they might never know. That was the terrible balance they had to maintain. Hope on one side, evidence on the other, and between them was uncertainty. The most famous piece of evidence remained the photograph from Kentucky. The young man in the photograph appeared to resemble Lewis. The family believed it could be him, but no definitive identification was ever made. There was no confirmed reunion, no verified record connecting the man to the Sodder family, no biological evidence proving that he was Lewis. And without that, the photograph remained a possibility rather than an answer. Still, the family kept it. For them, it represented something that was difficult to explain. Hope. The possibility that one of the children had survived. And if one had survived, perhaps the others had too. But the passing years made that possibility harder. If the children had survived, they would now be adults. They would have jobs, friends, families of their own. They would have identities. They would have spent decades living somewhere. How could 5 people disappear completely for so long? That question became increasingly difficult. Yet the opposite question was equally painful. If they had died in the fire, why had their remains never been conclusively identified? That question continued to trouble the family. The excavation in 1949 had produced 4 lumbar vertebrae, but the Smithsonian examination did not identify them as the remains of the missing children. The report also noted their skeletal development and lack of evidence of burning. For the family, that meant the physical evidence still did not give them certainty. But there was another possibility. Perhaps the remains had been destroyed or scattered. Perhaps the fire had been severe enough. Perhaps the search had simply failed. Those explanations could not be completely ruled out, and that is why the case remained unresolved. The evidence could support different interpretations. The family chose one. Authorities chose another. Neither could completely eliminate the other. By the time the 1980s arrived, Jenny was elderly. She had spent most of her adult life searching. The billboard had become part of the landscape. The 5 photographs had been seen by countless people, but the children had never returned. No one had come forward with definitive evidence. No confirmed grave had been found, and no confirmed adult identity had emerged. Still, Jenny refused to forget. She reportedly continued to believe that her children had survived. Her conviction remained strong even after decades had passed. That belief was not simply about evidence. It was also about a mother's refusal to accept an explanation she did not believe was complete. For Jenny, the lack of remains mattered. The strange circumstances of the fire mattered. The sightings mattered. And the photograph mattered. Together, they were enough for her to continue hoping. But eventually, the search became part of her final years. She continued living with the mystery until her death in 1989. The billboard was eventually removed after she died, and with it went one of the most visible reminders of the 5 missing children. But removing the billboard did not remove the mystery. The story continued, the photographs continued, the theories continued, and the questions remained. The Sodder children had never been conclusively found. The case had never produced a confirmed killer, and the family had never received a definitive explanation. Years later, people would continue revisiting the case. Some would focus on the fire. Others would focus on the missing remains. Some would focus on the sightings. Others would focus on the mysterious photograph. And some would focus on the people who had allegedly threatened George before the fire. Each theory tried to explain something, but none explained everything. That is why the case remains so difficult. Suppose the kidnapping theory is correct. Then someone had to take 5 children from the house. They had to transport them. They had to keep them hidden. And somehow, they had to prevent any confirmed identification for decades. That is possible to imagine, but there is no definitive evidence proving it happened. Now suppose the official explanation is correct. The children died in the fire. The fire destroyed their remains. The family, unable to accept the loss without physical evidence, spent decades searching for them. That is also possible, but it leaves the family with questions about the strange circumstances surrounding the fire. The missing ladder, the failed trucks, the telephone, the reported threats, the sightings, and the photograph. Neither explanation is perfect, and that is the heart of the mystery. The case does not offer an easy answer. It offers possibilities. As time passed, another problem became unavoidable. The people who could have solved the case were disappearing. Witnesses died, investigators died, family members died, and with each death, another piece of first-hand knowledge disappeared. That is one of the greatest dangers facing any cold case. Evidence does not always exist in boxes. Sometimes evidence is a person who remembers a conversation, a person who remembers a vehicle, a person who remembers seeing someone near a house, a person who knows a name. When that person dies, the information can disappear forever. The Sodder family understood this. That was why they continued asking people to come forward. Even after decades, they wanted anyone who knew something to speak. But no final witness appeared. No confession came. No hidden record solved the mystery. And no confirmed survivor returned. The case slowly moved from an active investigation into history. But history did not make the questions disappear. In fact, it made them more fascinating. People began asking whether modern forensic science could help. Could the old evidence be tested? Could the photograph be analyzed? Could unidentified remains somewhere in the country be compared with the Sodder family? Could new records reveal what happened? These are the kinds of questions that often bring attention back to cold cases. Technology changes, methods improve, and evidence that was useless decades ago can sometimes become valuable again. But the Sodder case has one enormous problem. Most of the original physical evidence is gone. The house burned in 1945. The scene was never preserved for modern examination, and many of the original materials have either disappeared or become difficult to verify. That means modern investigators have very little to work with. Still, the story continues to attract interest, because even without a solution, the questions remain compelling. What happened to 5 children? Why were no confirmed remains recovered? Why did so many reported sightings appear? Who sent the photograph? And why did the family remain convinced that the children had survived? Perhaps the answer lies in one of those questions. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere completely different. We simply do not know. And that is why it is important not to turn the mystery into certainty. A theory is not a fact. A reported sighting is not a confirmed identification. A resemblance is not proof. And the absence of remains does not automatically establish kidnapping. The story is powerful enough without inventing answers. The facts themselves are already haunting. 5 children disappeared during a Christmas Eve house fire. Their family searched for decades. A famous billboard carried their photographs. Possible sightings appeared. A mysterious photograph appeared. And still no definitive answer arrived. That is the story. And that is why the Sodder children continue to be remembered. Their disappearance became one of those mysteries that refuses to disappear itself. Every generation can ask the same question. What happened? Maybe someday, an old document will be discovered. Maybe someone will recognize the man in the photograph. Maybe a forgotten family record will reveal something. Maybe a witness left behind a diary. Maybe an overlooked piece of evidence will finally make sense. Or maybe the truth is already lost. Perhaps the people who knew what happened took the answer with them when they died. That possibility is painful, but it is also realistic. Not every mystery eventually receives a perfect solution. Some cases remain unresolved because the evidence is incomplete. Some remain unresolved because witnesses disappear. Some remain unresolved because mistakes were made at the beginning. And some remain unresolved because the truth was deliberately hidden. We cannot know which explanation applies here. But one thing is certain. The Sodder family never stopped caring. They never stopped remembering. And they never stopped asking about the 5 children. That may be the most important legacy of the case. The mystery did not erase the children's lives. The photographs kept their faces alive. The family's search kept their names alive. And every discussion of the case brought their story back into public memory. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, 5 children, 5 lives, 5 empty places in a family, and 1 unanswered question. As we approach the end of this story, there is no dramatic confession waiting for us. There is no confirmed suspect. There is no final piece of evidence that allows us to say exactly what happened. Instead, there is a mystery that has survived more than 80 years. The official conclusion says one thing. The family's belief says another. And the surviving evidence does not allow us to completely settle the disagreement. Perhaps that is why the story remains so haunting. Because the fire ended in a few hours. But the search lasted for decades. The flames disappeared. The smoke disappeared. The house disappeared. But the question remained. Where were the 5 children? And somewhere, beneath all the theories and all the speculation, there is a simple human truth. A family wanted their children back. They searched. They waited. They hoped. And they never received the answer they deserved. More than 80 years have passed since the Sodder home burned on Christmas Eve. Yet the same questions remain. What happened to the 5 children? Did they die inside the house? Were they taken somewhere? Was the fire an accident? Or was it deliberately started? And if someone knew the truth, why did that person never come forward? These questions have followed the Sodder family for generations. But as we reach the final part of the story, it is important to separate what is known from what remains uncertain. We know that the Sodder home burned during the early hours of December 25, 1945. We know that 5 children were believed to be inside the house. We know that the children were never conclusively recovered or identified. And we know that their parents spent decades searching for answers. Beyond those facts, the story becomes much more complicated. The official explanation was that the children died in the fire. The Sodder family did not accept that conclusion. They believed the circumstances suggested something else. The missing ladder, the failed trucks, the telephone problem, the strange noise before the fire, the threats George had received, the reported sightings, and eventually the mysterious photograph. Each detail became part of the family's belief that the children had survived. But none of those details, individually or together, produced a confirmed identification of the children after 1945. That distinction matters, because the longer a mystery survives, the easier it becomes for theories to become accepted as facts. A reported sighting becomes a confirmed sighting. A suspicious person becomes a suspect. A photograph becomes proof. And a possibility becomes a conclusion. But the Sodder case does not give us enough evidence to make those jumps. The photograph from Kentucky is a perfect example. The young man looked remarkably similar to Louis. The message on the back appeared to identify him. But there was no independent confirmation that the man was actually Louis. No verified reunion occurred. No biological evidence established his identity. So the photograph remains mysterious. It is an intriguing clue, but it is not a confirmed answer. Chapter 14. The Questions That Remained. More than 80 years have passed since the Sodder home burned on Christmas Eve. Yet the same questions remain. What happened to the 5 children? Did they die inside the house? Were they taken somewhere? Was the fire an accident? Or was it deliberately started? And if someone knew the truth, why did that person never come forward? These questions have followed the Sodder family for generations. But as we reach the final part of the story, it is important to separate what is known from what remains uncertain. We know that the Sodder home burned during the early hours of December 25, 1945. We know that 5 children were believed to be inside the house. We know that the children were never conclusively recovered or identified. And we know that their parents spent decades searching for answers. Beyond those facts, the story becomes much more complicated. The official explanation was that the children died in the fire. The Sodder family did not accept that conclusion. They believed the circumstances suggested something else. The missing ladder, the failed trucks, the telephone problem, the strange noise before the fire, the threats George had received, the reported sightings, and eventually the mysterious photograph. Each detail became part of the family's belief that the children had survived. But none of those details, individually or together, produced a confirmed identification of the children after 1945. That distinction matters, because the longer a mystery survives, the easier it becomes for theories to become accepted as facts. A reported sighting becomes a confirmed sighting. A suspicious person becomes a suspect. A photograph becomes proof, and a possibility becomes a conclusion. But the Sodder case does not give us enough evidence to make those jumps. The photograph from Kentucky is a perfect example. The young man looked remarkably similar to Lewis. The message on the back appeared to identify him, but there was no independent confirmation that the man was actually Lewis. No verified reunion occurred. No biological evidence established his identity, so the photograph remains mysterious. It is an intriguing clue, but it is not a confirmed answer. The same is true of the reported sightings. Some people claim to have seen the children after the fire. Those reports were important enough for the family to investigate, but none resulted in a confirmed identification. A person can genuinely believe they saw someone and still be mistaken. Memory is not a perfect recording, and in a case involving missing children, emotions can make identification even more difficult. The fire itself presents another problem. It happened in 1945. Modern forensic fire investigation was far less advanced. The house was destroyed. The original scene was not preserved in the way a modern crime scene would be. And every year that passed made reconstruction more difficult. That means some questions may never be answered. For example, the exact cause and progression of the fire cannot now be reconstructed with complete certainty. The family believed the fire was deliberate. Authorities concluded it was accidental. And the surviving evidence is not enough to settle every part of that disagreement. Then there is the question of the children's remains. This is perhaps the strongest reason the mystery survived. No remains were conclusively identified as belonging to the 5 children. The 1949 excavation produced 4 lumbar vertebrae. The Smithsonian examined them. The bones were identified as belonging to 1 person. Their skeletal development appeared older than most of the missing children, although the report acknowledged that the development could potentially fit a boy around 14 and a half. The bones also showed no evidence of burning. The report suggested they may have come from the dirt used to fill the basement after the fire rather than from the children. Smithsonianmag.com. For the family, this was deeply significant, but it still did not prove that the children survived. It only meant that the discovered bones did not provide the identification everyone had hoped for. That left 2 possibilities. Either the children died and the physical evidence was destroyed or lost, or they survived and disappeared. Neither possibility was conclusively established, and that is where the story becomes uncomfortable. We want a mystery to have an ending. We want to know who did it. We want to know why. But sometimes history does not give us that. Sometimes evidence disappears. Sometimes mistakes are made. Sometimes witnesses remember incorrectly. And sometimes people die before they can explain what they knew. The Sodder family spent decades trying to prevent that from happening. They wanted the story remembered. They wanted the children remembered. And they wanted people to continue asking questions. That is why the billboard mattered so much. It was not just a sign. It was a refusal to forget. 5 children's faces, 5 names, and 1 question. What was their fate? For nearly 4 decades, the billboard stood as a public reminder. People drove past it. Children grew up seeing it. Adults remembered it. The case became part of the landscape. Eventually, Jenny died in 1989. The billboard was removed after her death, but by then, the story had already become part of American true crime history. The Sodder family had spent almost half a century searching. George had died 20 years earlier. Jenny had continued, and after she was gone, the surviving family members inherited the mystery. They inherited the photographs, they inherited the stories, and they inherited the unanswered questions. Some family members continued believing that the children had survived. Others recognized that there was no way to prove it, but the mystery remained important, not because a particular theory had been proven, because the family had never received certainty. That is a different kind of tragedy. When someone dies, grief eventually has a place to go. There is a funeral, there is a grave, there is a final goodbye. But when someone disappears, there may be no final moment. The mind continues searching. Maybe they are alive. Maybe someone has them. Maybe they are somewhere nearby. Maybe tomorrow will bring an answer. For the Sodders, tomorrow lasted decades, and every Christmas must have carried a reminder of that night. The holiday that was supposed to represent family and celebration became permanently connected with loss. The children who were preparing for Christmas never reached Christmas morning. The surviving family members did, and they had to live with that difference. That emotional reality is sometimes lost when the case is discussed as a mystery. But behind every clue was a family. Behind every photograph was a child. And behind every theory was a group of people trying to understand an unimaginable loss. That is why the most responsible way to tell the story is not to claim an answer we do not have. Instead, we can examine the evidence. We can acknowledge the strange circumstances. We can discuss the theories. But we should also admit when something remains unknown. And in the Sodder case, many things remain unknown. We do not know exactly what happened to the 5 children after the fire began. We do not know whether they died inside the house. We do not know whether they were taken. We do not know who sent the Kentucky photograph. And we do not know whether the young man pictured was Lewis. We also do not know whether the reported sightings were genuine. Those questions remain. And perhaps one of the most haunting possibilities is that the truth was known by someone who simply never spoke. Imagine that, somewhere in the decades after the fire, a person may have carried information about what happened. They may have known where the children went. They may have known who started the fire. They may have known whether the children survived. But if that person never spoke, the truth could have disappeared with them. There is no way to know whether that happened. But it is one possibility among many. Another possibility is much simpler. Perhaps there was no kidnapping. Perhaps there was no conspiracy. Perhaps the fire really did kill the children. Perhaps the lack of remains was the result of the destruction and the limitations of the original investigation. Perhaps the strange events surrounding the fire were coincidences. And perhaps the later sightings and photograph were mistakes or hoaxes. That explanation is less mysterious. But sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. The difficulty is that we cannot prove it either. That is why the Sodder case continues to divide opinion. People look at the same evidence and see different possibilities. Some see a kidnapping. Some see a tragic fire. Some see an investigation that was badly handled. Others see a mystery that may never be solved. And perhaps all we can honestly say is that the evidence does not provide a definitive answer. The family wanted more. They deserved more. But history does not always give families what they deserve. Sometimes the truth remains hidden. Still, the search itself mattered, because the Sodder family refused to let 5 children disappear completely from memory. They kept their photographs. They kept their names. They kept the billboard. And they kept asking questions. That meant the children remained remembered. Maurice was remembered. Martha was remembered. Lewis was remembered. Jenny was remembered. Betty was remembered. They were not forgotten. And perhaps that is one thing the family could control. They could not control what happened on Christmas Eve. They could not recover the lost evidence. They could not force a witness to speak. They could not turn back time. But they could remember. They could tell the story. And they could keep searching. The case eventually became a reminder of the limitations of investigations from another era. Today, investigators have tools that would have been unimaginable in 1945. DNA analysis, digital databases, modern forensic anthropology, advanced fire scene reconstruction, facial comparison technology. None of those tools existed when the Sodder home burned. And that is why some mysteries from that period are so difficult to solve. The evidence that could have answered the question may simply no longer exist. That does not mean investigators should stop asking. It means they have to be careful about what they claim. A cold case deserves patience. It deserves evidence. And it deserves respect for the people involved. The Sodder children were real people. Their family was real. Their grief was real. The mystery is interesting, but their loss was not entertainment. That is something worth remembering whenever we tell stories like this. As we approach the end, the story returns to the same place where it began. A quiet home in Fayetteville. A family preparing for Christmas. A fire during the early hours of the morning. 5 children who were never conclusively found. And parents who refused to accept an answer they believed was incomplete. George died still searching. Jenny died still searching. Their children grew older. Their grandchildren grew older. And the mystery remained. Perhaps the children died that night. Perhaps they survived. Perhaps the truth is somewhere between those possibilities. We cannot say with certainty, and that is why the case remains unsolved. There is no final suspect to name, no confirmed motive, no confirmed survivor, no confirmed grave, only evidence, memories, theories, and questions. But there is one final thing the family left behind, a reminder that even when an investigation ends, a family's search for truth does not necessarily end with it. The Sodders kept asking, they kept looking, they kept the photographs visible, and they refused to allow the 5 children to become forgotten names. More than 80 years later, their names are still remembered, and perhaps that is why their story continues. Not because we know exactly what happened, but because we do not. The mystery remains open in the minds of those who continue to examine it. And somewhere inside that uncertainty is the possibility that one day, a forgotten piece of information could finally change the story. Until that happens, the 5 Sodder children remain missing. And the Christmas Eve fire remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. More than 80 years have passed since the Sodder family's Christmas Eve ended in tragedy. The house is gone. The people who first investigated the fire are gone. George and Jenny are gone. Many of the witnesses are gone. And yet, the 5 children remain remembered. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. Their story began as a family tragedy. It became an investigation, then a mystery, and eventually, one of the most enduring unsolved disappearances in American history. The official conclusion has always been straightforward. The children were inside the house when it burned. They died in the fire. Their remains were destroyed or lost among the ruins. But the family never accepted that explanation. Not because they had absolute proof that the children survived. They did not. They simply believed there were too many unanswered questions. The telephone, the ladder, the trucks, the strange sounds before the fire, the reported threats, the later sightings, and the mysterious photograph that appeared decades later. Each detail kept the possibility alive, but none provided a final answer. That is what makes the case so difficult. There is enough evidence to create doubt, but not enough evidence to create certainty. And after so many decades, that distinction matters more than ever. The Sodder family spent years asking one simple question. What happened to our children? They did not ask for a theory. They wanted the truth. If the children had died, they wanted to know where their remains were. If the children had survived, they wanted to bring them home. They were willing to accept a painful answer. What they could not accept was no answer at all. That uncertainty shaped the rest of their lives. George spent almost 24 years searching. He investigated reports. He followed leads. He contacted authorities. He hired investigators. He placed photographs on a billboard. And he kept believing that something had been missed. When he died in 1969, he never learned what had happened. Jenny continued the search. She kept the children's photographs. She continued to believe that they might have survived. And she remained determined to keep their story visible. The billboard stood for decades. Thousands of people saw the children's faces. Some probably wondered about them. Others may have forgotten the sign as soon as they drove past. But for the Sodder family, those photographs represented 5 children who had never received a proper ending. The billboard eventually disappeared after Jenny's death in 1989. But the mystery did not disappear with it. The family continued remembering. The next generation learned the story, and eventually, the case became known far beyond West Virginia. People began studying the photographs. They discussed the fire. They examined the reports. They debated the possibility of kidnapping. And they asked whether the famous Kentucky photograph might really show Lewis as an adult. But there is still no verified answer. The photograph remains unconfirmed. The reported sightings remain unconfirmed. The kidnapping theory remains unconfirmed. And the accidental fire explanation, while official, cannot answer every question that has surrounded the case. So perhaps the most honest ending is not an answer. It is an acknowledgement. We do not know. We do not know exactly what happened to the 5 children. We do not know whether they died in the fire. We do not know whether they were taken. We do not know whether the fire was deliberately started. We do not know who sent the photograph. And we do not know whether the man in that photograph was Lewis. Those questions remain. But there is something we do know. The Sodder family never stopped searching. And because they never stopped, the children were never completely forgotten. That may be the most important part of the story. The mystery did not erase their identities. It preserved them. Every time their names are spoken, they are remembered. Every time their photographs are shown, people are reminded that they were real children. They had parents. They had brothers and sisters. They had a home. They had Christmas plans. They had ordinary lives. And then in one terrible night, everything changed. Imagine what their parents experienced that morning. The house was gone. 5 children were missing. And there was no body to bury, no final goodbye, no certainty, only ashes and questions. That kind of loss can follow a family forever. And it did. The surviving Sodder children grew up. They married. They had children of their own. Life continued. But the 5 missing siblings remained part of the family story. The children who disappeared did not grow older in the family's memories. They remained frozen in the photographs. Maurice remained 14. Martha remained 12. Lewis remained 9. Jenny remained 8. Betty remained 5. But the family around those photographs continued aging. That contrast is one of the saddest parts of the story. A family moved forward while 5 members remained trapped in one night. And perhaps that is why the case continues to affect people. It is not only about a mysterious fire. It is about the human need for closure. We want to know where our loved ones are. We want to know what happened. We want to have somewhere to place our grief. The Sodders never received that opportunity. Instead, they spent decades living with uncertainty. And uncertainty can be its own kind of suffering. The family had to make decisions without knowing whether the children were dead or alive. They had to respond to sightings without knowing whether they were genuine. They had to examine photographs without knowing whether they showed their missing son. They had to listen to theories without knowing which, if any, were correct. And every new lead brought the same emotional risk. Hope, then disappointment. Hope, then disappointment. Again and again. Yet they continued. That persistence is part of why the story survived. If the family had accepted the official explanation immediately, the case might have disappeared into history. Instead, they challenged it. They asked questions. They demanded more evidence. They kept the photographs visible. And they refused to let the children become forgotten. Whether the family's theory was correct or not, their determination preserved the mystery. And that means the 5 children are still remembered today. Perhaps someday, technology will uncover something. A surviving document, a forgotten photograph, a DNA connection, a family record, a witness statement, something that can finally answer the question. Or perhaps nothing new will ever be discovered. The truth may already be lost. The people who knew it may have died. The evidence may have disappeared. The house may have burned away the answers along with everything else. That is the possibility we have to accept. Some mysteries do not end with a confession. Some do not end with a body. Some do not end with a final photograph. Some simply remain. And the Sodder case may be one of them. But there is still value in remembering it. Because remembering is different from believing. We can remember the family without claiming that a theory is true. We can discuss the suspicious details without declaring them proof. We can examine the photograph without pretending we know who the man was. And we can acknowledge the possibility that the official explanation may be correct while still recognizing why the family questioned it. That is the fairest way to approach the story. The evidence is incomplete. The mystery is unresolved. and the truth remains unknown. But the children themselves are not unknown. We know their names. We know their faces. We know that they were loved. And we know that their parents spent the rest of their lives searching for them. That is something no theory can change. So as this story comes to an end, perhaps the final question should not be, were the Sodder children kidnapped? Or, did they die in the fire? Instead, perhaps it should be, will we ever know? That is the question that has survived for more than 80 years. And perhaps one day, someone will find the answer. Until then, the Sodder children remain exactly where the family left them. In memory, in photographs, in the stories passed from one generation to another. 5 children who disappeared on Christmas Eve. 5 lives interrupted. 5 names that were never forgotten. And one mystery that still has no final chapter. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. Wherever the truth lies, their story remains. And perhaps that is the one thing their family always wanted. For someone to remember them. For someone to keep asking. For someone to look at their photographs and understand that behind the mystery were 5 children who were deeply loved. The fire destroyed their home. It did not destroy their memory. And after all these years, their names are still being spoken. Their story is still being told. And the question their parents asked so many years ago still remains. What was their fate? We may never know, but we can remember. And sometimes, when an answer cannot be found, remembering becomes the last way of keeping someone alive in the world.